original hearing, as an operator, a licence owner, I was a little bit concerned that the Department of Transport was deficient in proving the process which Uber used to recruit drivers and to circumvent some of the legalities that they would like to talk about. So what I did with my submission was remove the emotion and tried to give the committee a chronological view of what Uber does when it starts to look at and expand into areas, and how the facts and figures that they present to the public are false. So that's my business, and how Uber is affecting my business, both in terms of drivers, the uncertainty, and the actual decrease in my taxable income that I pass on through to the government.
Thank you very much. Okay, we'll have a series of questions now for the next 20 minutes. In your submission, you state that that Uber was launched on the Gold Coast in August 2014.
Yes.
Can you provide a summary of what has happened to your business since then? I know you just talked about it a little bit, but can you give more detail?
So with a taxi driver, the taxi operation is 24/7, every day of the week. That means that there will be peaks and there will be troughs. The taxi industry and the drivers know that. They know that by driving Friday, Saturday night when they're operating in those peak times, that the clawback was that they will have to operate in the non-peak times to service the wheelchairs, the school runs and those off-peak demand times. What's happened on the Gold Coast, Uber has cherry-picked. They are out there, and in my submission I showed you that they guarantee to pay drivers $40 an hour, whether they do a job or not. So they're actually creating an artificial demand out there, and in which case a driver on the Gold Coast, if they logged into the Uber app for Friday, Saturday night, could possibly earn $800 and not do a single job. Now, when that comes to a taxi driver, if he sees people getting paid to do nothing, then obviously that's an opportunity for him because that's his area of expertise. The driver that drives on Friday, Saturday night, when that artificial demand has been created, what ultimately happens is those Uber drivers will congregate in the main areas, Broadbeach, Surfers, Burleigh, Tweed, and they will clog up, even to the point where they're actually sitting at the back and front of taxi ranks now, parking spaces in hotels. That demand then, when the customer comes out, they will go to a cheaper option, which at the moment is Uber. So my drivers who have been waiting on a rank, waiting for an hour or two of a job, suddenly see someone else take that job. Obviously that's very disheartening for the drivers, because why should they have to service the public on Monday, Tuesday, when what they really were relying on was Friday, Saturday nights to get them through? So it means that we have a reduction in the number of drivers that are coming through our school. We've lost drivers to Uber because they're guaranteed money even though they don't do a job. Ultimately that means it affects the amount of time that a car can be on the road and also how much we actually earn. In figures, we are down 20 to 30%. We are not in our peak time yet, which is coming up now, Christmas, New Year, but on the Gold Coast there are over 1,400 Uber drivers. There are 357 taxis that can only be on the road. So when someone says that Uber is a small part of the playing field, they are actually 4 to 5 times bigger than Gold Coast cabs. So as it has dramatically affected our drivers, it has dramatically affected our income for our owners, and as my business as an operator, where I get a percentage of what the vehicle earns, 20 to 30% decrease.
When you talk about the number of vehicles that Uber run and the locations where they're picking up and the fact that they're paying the $40 per hour, whether they carry customers or not, have you actually done any research? Do you have any data or any way that you can back up those statements?
I can back them up with confidential information, which I'm happy to supply, with the reduction in income and the drop-off in calls that are going through to our call centre. Yes. Okay. But obviously, as you understand, being a public transport provider, we already supply that data and some of it through to the government. Uber, under the right to information, can actually access that. So they would love to know where the major jobs are, what time of the day. This is a data company that can data mine our information and make sure they target their operation to affect us even more.
Well, let me assure you, if you give it to the committee in confidence, that'll be the end of it. It won't go any further than that.
That will be supplied.
Okay, thank you very much.
Shane, as a committee, we're here to look at this particular bill. This particular bill seeks to increase the demerit points associated with operating what is deemed to be an illegal taxi service. The government has put in place a review which is going to be handed down next year. We are in a position where we can look at amendments if need be, make suggestions to the government about how to make this bill better. Would you suggest that demerit points is the best way of dealing with this, or is there something you in particular would like to see done differently?
I think the option is, and I'm so glad that Uber did submit something, because on the first page of their submission in their cover sheet, it says legislators are responsible to the electorate for the development of thoughtful, effective and equitable laws. The current legislation is not effective. It's as simple as that. Uber are a $50 billion company. The reason we have laws and we have a compliance system is to act as a deterrent. We now have Uber almost $1.7 million in fine and expanding. So it is not an effective, equitable law. So the only way then is, as Uber have said, is your job is to develop thoughtful and effective and equitable laws. So I agree with Uber. It must be effective. And the only way that I consider, after 28 years in the taxi industry, is actually to go after those people that actually operate the vehicle. Because Uber was a faceless person. Even though someone will come here today and they'll fly back to Hong Kong, actually to go and talk to someone in Uber that actually does the service is the driver. It's the only person that must be held accountable for that service. Because all Uber says is, we're just the provider. We connect. We're the conduit between the driver and the rider. So in reality, we've either got to stop it one way, which is the rider, and they won't stop because it's a cheaper alternative, because there's no red legislation, there's no red tape, or whether that be compliance with insurance, which is fair and equitable. So you then therefore have to impact the supplier, which is the actual driver. So in my view, after I've considered this for 18 months, the only way is to actually give demerit points when an Uber driver is caught.
Okay. So it's been suggested to us that demerit points are mostly used for safety aspects. So if the law thinks that a driver is not acting safely, exceeding the speed limit by a dramatic amount, or something like that, that's when demerit points are used, but not in the instance of trying to fix a commercial outcome for something. What are your comments around that?
I would love my taxi drivers not to be issued demerit points for parking in a disabled parking spot or in a bus lane. So there's difference between a safety issue and a demerit type of system. So I understand that, but your job is to be an effective legislation. The current legislation you have is not effective. And if it means that you have to increase or change the legislation to bring in a harsher penalty to be effective, then it must be demerit points. There's no other option. What has worked overseas in Germany, where it has been shut down, Uber has been shut down, is they've increased the fine and made it a criminal activity. We're talking $1 million fine per instance. Now, Uber aren't going to pay that, or a criminal offence on the driver. So, as I put in my submission, when the Department of Transport said they were unable to give you a definite answer of where they are, what Uber will say is they operate in 200 countries and things like that. They might operate, but they're actually operating illegally. They are banned in most developed, regulated taxi environments. And by our standards, a fine of 1,700 is insignificant to the German fine of €1 million. Belgium, the Netherlands have been shut down, again, because they've threatened them with criminal convictions and massive fines. So if we want to go down that avenue and start issuing $1 million per occurrence, it probably will have the same effect. But our compliance then needs to be able to ensure that the driver is caught, prosecuted correctly through the courts, and then the fine is paid.
Okay, so you think the best form of fixing this is to go at the drivers as such. When we asked the department for clarity around whether Uber itself was illegal or not, they said they were unable to determine that. Do you think that the government should be doing some work on determining or making sure that they're either legal or illegal?
I don't think it needs to be determined. What I saw from the Department of Transport when they were here, it was 4 acting Department of Transport people. So they weren't actually in that position, they were acting. Now, as part of an operator, that concerns me, that our department is unaware of how Uber recruit, how they dispatch their system. So I go back to the first page of my submission is, a taxi service means a public passenger service other than an excluded public passenger service provided by a motor vehicle under which the vehicle, A, is able when hired to be hailed for hire by members of the public, or provides a demand responsive service under which members of the public are able to hire the vehicle through electronic communication, or C, or stands for hire on a road. Now, Uber have tried to convince successive governments around the world that legislation in the transport industry is archaic. It hasn't evolved. I want you just to have a look at that one that is through electronic communication. It doesn't say smartphone. It says electronic. I know the person that put that in there. Because what they thought of was, you might say smartphone, then Uber will say, well, hang on, you can do it on an app for your iPad. So it's not really a phone. You can actually do it on your Google Watch. So what was actually happening is the Queensland government, the reason why it's so regulated and has such a very good transport legislation is that word electronic communication. So in actual fact, several years ago, the people that were running the Department of Transport knew this was coming and could see that let's not just stop ourselves at mobile phones and things like that. Let's look at it as electronic communication. So no, I believe that our current legislation is adequate, and by looking at that and the submission I've given you, and I have another document that I'd like to be tabled because this has actually happened since my submission closed, and in there it will show you that Uber have actually set up Uber zones in Melbourne. We won't call them taxi ranks, we'll talk of Uber zones, which is exactly the same as a taxi rank. We'll just change the words. If it walks like a duck, it quacks like a duck, it's a duck. Yep. So in those 3 things, our current legislation is years ahead of other states and other countries. Yep.
Thanks, Shane. Are you guys happy to have those document table? Thank you.
And the reason why I've had to add that is in the last couple of weeks, Uber have expanded to the Sunshine Coast. They've announced on Facebook that they're looking for drivers in Cairns. They've talked about Gladstone, Rockhampton, Mackay and Toowoomba. On top of that, Uber will also say that they would like self-regulation. The second one down, driver recruitment, you can now join Uber online and never meet anyone in person. And you can do that in less than 5 minutes. So in less than 5 minutes I can leave here, submit my paperwork online, never meet anyone from Uber, and I can log into the driver app and be picking someone up around the corner. So those are the things that have changed in the last couple of weeks since the submission closed.
I imagine, Shane, your accountant would have a value placed on the licences that you control. I don't want to know what that is. Has that been impacted since...
We've had several...
maybe not just Uber, but ride sharing in general, and what do you see the future of that value?
A taxi licence on the Gold Coast, I'm not going to reveal the value, but what I will say is that major banks are now concerned. We have owners, and these are owners that have been in the industry. They've paid their taxes. We actually have the best public-private partnership of any industry. give us a taxi licence for the public, which we privately invest in. The Queensland Government and Australian governments want superannuation funds to invest in infrastructure. I have owners that have it in their self-managed super fund. They've done it. They're years ahead. They're in family trusts, they're in company names, self-managed super funds. So those values, I would give you a figure of around about $120,000 that they've lost. That's the uncertainty and the fact that the banks now are coming in and revaluing, asking for market rates, and if there's not many sales that have gone through, they go on the last sale. So, yes, it is very impacting on that.
Shane, have you got a question?
Just in regards to the banks, what is the like a cost for you as a taxi operator for a taxi licence compared to Uber?
With Uber, I can use my own car. I can use the current registration I'm on, which would be $550 a year, and that is it. To run a taxi licence, if I go off the last government tender several years ago, it's about $500,000. I think the committee needs to understand that no one in the taxi industry has ever resisted advances. When the government brought in security cameras, we agreed to it. When the government brought in 24-hour GPS tracking, we agreed to it. We've now agreed to audio recording. You've mandated certain levels of insurance that we've got to have, CTP. So a taxi licence, for me to put on the road this year, the CTP and registration will be just under $7,000. To get full comprehensive insurance is $4,400. To protect my driver under a personal accident and injury, it's $550. So before I've made a single cent, I'm up for $12,000. I then have to have a vehicle that's less than 6 years old. Go out and buy a brand new Toyota Camry at $30,000. My driver gets half of what he earns. So to actually look at the costs, I have a $500,000 licence plus the stamp duty I've paid and a reoccurring $12,000 a year. And Uber, $550.
Just in regards to, and this is probably not the right wording that you use, but some of the misinformation that Uber is spreading or counteracting some of the issues that are being brought up here. What can you elaborate on that?
Sure. So the first one I'd like to say is they have Uber zones, which is a taxi rank. You'll notice in their submission, which is their ride-sharing one today, which they'll wheel out, 9 times in there they'll tell you they don't do rank work. In actual fact, they do. Okay. On top of that, they look at it and say that there's a monopoly. Taxi industry is a monopoly. Gold Coast Cabs has 357 licences. They're actually owned by individuals. It's not a monopoly. The only monopoly in the room is actually Uber, because my drivers, there's 51 operators on licences on the Gold Coast. If a driver doesn't like the way I operate or the vehicle I've got, they can move to any one of those other 50. With Uber, there's one. Okay, so the image that we are a monopoly is totally false. The information that they provide about the taxi industry, again in their paperwork on page 12, they come up with a graph that says that taxis are late. We're so late, we actually don't arrive on time. In their own submission, in actual fact, 72% of taxis, if you book the taxi, arrives on time or earlier. In 2011, those taxis that were running late by 7.9 minutes. In 2013, the taxi industry had brought that down to 2.3 minutes. So if you booked a taxi, in actual fact, in 2013, if it was late, the average was 2.3 minutes, which in today's traffic, I think is a reasonable standard. The other perception that they do, that they say, is that 80% of the fare goes back into the community. That is currently what it is. Everyone in this room knows that Uber want to go to a fully autonomous, driverless car. So my question is then, if Uber get all the money and there's no driver, there's no more 80% going into the community. All of that money, all of that fare would be siphoned off to a tax minimisation in the Netherlands. So understand that when we look at future legislation, are we going to allow a totally foreign-owned company to come in and provide public service for us, and all of that money, that revenue, go overseas? So the perception is there that the taxi industry, runs late, that we don't support our local community, that's there. The other thing that Uber do quite well is they actually team up with, or go into partnership and promotion with, legitimate businesses. On the Gold Coast, they go to universities, nightclubs. In actual fact, when I've called those businesses, once the advertisements come out, there is no way that they would have entered that partnership if they'd known or Uber had told them that they were illegal in Queensland. So what they try and do is legitimise their business by partnering with actual legal businesses to create the perception that they are legal.
Shane, we'll pick the rest of the submission. I just got one more quick question, if you don't mind.
Shane Glenn Butcher from Gladstone here. Just want to, in your submission, you mentioned the ghost cars. Can you just explain to the committee what ghost cars are and how they work?
So what happened was, when the Queensland government said that we are still going to make compliance an issue, what Uber did then, because remember it's a data system that works with Google. Google is an investor. They created ghost cars. So what this meant was that suddenly, where a compliance officer could see you sitting in your Uber car in a car park, he could walk up to you, see the Uber app on the phone, and say, mate, are you driving for Uber? There's an infringement notice. So what Uber did was they just changed that. If we can't see the cars and we create ghost cars that move around, then you'll never be able to know which one are the real cars and which ones aren't. The other thing that Uber can do is change the time delay on the vehicles. So where a compliance officer could see a vehicle and see it on the screen, oh, that one's moving away, it has to be that one, Uber would delay that by a couple of minutes so that you really wouldn't know which car now is leaving. So the ghost cars went on for several months until it became apparent that maybe the Queensland government might let Uber come in which case it was switched off. There was no more compliance, no more ghost cars. And it frustrated two people. One was a customer because they opened up the app and said, look, all these cars coming around, but they weren't actually there. And number two, the driver, the Uber driver, who I don't have much sort of sympathy for, in the fact that he was getting customers that were complaining, saying, I've seen all these cars, why did it take you 10 minutes to get here? So that's the backlash from the rider and the driver, as well as the fact that the government indicated that it might actually change the legislation, in which case it was turned on and off. I actually have video footage for that, and once again I'll submit it through. So you can actually see that these ghost cars come from the forest, and they come, 20 seconds later they start again, and they keep on coming down, and that's it.
Yeah, if you could make that available to us, that'd be
Absolutely.
very handy. And thank you, mate, because we've run out of time.
Beautiful.
Okay, representatives from the Taxi Council, please. For the record, could you please state your name and position?
Benjamin Wash, I'm Chief Executive Officer of Taxi Council Queensland.
Thank you. And would you like to make a short opening statement?
Yes, I'd just like to thank the Chair and the committee for giving Taxi Council the opportunity to come and provide evidence today. I'm very aware of the size of the number of submissions that you guys received and the amount of work that you have to get through between this and other committees, so I'll keep my opening statements very brief.
Thank you.
First and foremost, I'd like to actually acknowledge the fact that there's two very distinct things occurring in the taxi industry, and contrary to any other evidence you may hear during the course of this process, I'd like to make sure that you keep in mind that this is very much about the bill, as Mr Hart actually stated before, and there is also a review going on. That review was set down for a time frame in 2008 by the then Minister Rachel Nolan, and whatever that review transpires in that review is not to be confused with this issue that is here. The issue before us is about the enforcement and penalties that are associated with the operation of illegal taxis, and the fact that the current penalties and enforcement regimes were proving insufficient. I think it's worth noting that just a couple of years ago, through some industry liaison groups that were run by the Department of Transport and Main Roads, there was a group of people who were tasked with going through websites such as Gumtree, Craigslist and other classified type websites, seeking out the operation of illegal taxis and writing to them and offering advice in terms of shutting down because they're operating services without a taxi service licence. And in actual fact, just 6 months before that, there was an exclusive done by a 10 News investigation team on the Korean community offering illegal taxi services, and the government brought the full weight of their compliance activity to bear on that. Fast forward to now, and again, notwithstanding what may be in any of the other submissions, the actual fact is nothing has changed as far as the legislation goes. The only thing that appears to have changed is that the department have become overwhelmed in terms of being able to compliance this activity. Previously, financial penalties or the threat of financial penalties was sufficient to modify people's behaviour to not offer those services, even though they might not have been aware that those services were illegal. There's a lot of discussion around the fact that the legislation doesn't effectively or didn't effectively anticipate the current technology, I suppose. In actual fact, it absolutely anticipated that, and I don't need to go into that. What it didn't anticipate, however, was a company whose modus operandi was to operate outside of the regulation and to just simply treat as an operational cost any penalties that are born of that. I must state, as I did last time I appeared before the committee, it's not just one company. That one company happens to be much more bold and brash than others and much better financed. But as recent as this week, we have small illegal taxi operators advertising back on the web in central Queensland offering to do illegal taxi services. It's not about a particular company. It's not about commercially penalising a new business model or however it may be described. It really is simply about the rule of law and ensuring that the outcomes expected by the Queensland community for taxi services remains unchallenged until such time as a review may come back and give the government something to consider as far as reforms. But that's not what this is about. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you. Just go back to the review to start off with. Might help us to get a good understanding of that, because my understanding was there's a review that's coming up in 2 years' time, is it, or next year, or...
No,
the proper review that you guys had in place, where you would have a review with the government about the services and that all provided.
That was set down in 2008 when they... when the
it's supposed to be every 4 years or 5 years or something after that?
Well, it was set down in 2008 when the government adopted the 2010 to 2015 Queensland Taxi Strategic Plan.
That's right, yes.
So that's the plan. Having said that, I anticipated, to be honest, I anticipated the former government to actually announce a review in it with sufficient lead time so that when we got to the 31st of December this year, we weren't left with a gaping hole in terms of the seamless sort of movement to a new strategy. But that didn't occur for any number of reasons.
Yep. Well, given that this issue has been developing for a while, the Uber issue, I had an understanding that the Taxi Council had spoken with government and they were happy to wait until that review process came to a position where the review commenced. What I can't understand is why would the Taxi Council, if that is true, why would the Taxi Council say that they don't really want to deal with that until such time as that review comes around?
Well, firstly, I can refute those comments. That's not the case at all. What we said was we understand that there are regulatory reforms that are coming up in the review and the review of the strategic plan. Having said that, if there is any regulatory reform that's going to affect the structure of the industry, that needs to take time. As far as this issue, we never said that we wanted to see the government suspend any of the existing regulations pending the outcome of that review. What we said is that enforcement needs to be carried out on the streets now as it stands. And at no point on public record or in private have I said that we're happy to see this issue dealt with entirely during that process.
Okay. Could you give me your version of an illegal taxi service?
So an illegal taxi service is any service that offers either street hail, rank and hail work, or is available on demand through some sort of booking system to take someone somewhere from point A to point B for commercial hire.
Michael, just a couple of questions.
Yeah, Ben, as I said to the previous submitter, we're here to look at this particular issue and demerit points, but you've proposed a few amendments in your submission. Can you step us through the reasoning behind that?
Sure. The amendments that we've proposed is to the Transport Operation Road Use Management Act. And in one of the schedules of that Act, and just for everyone's, I'll refer to it as TORUM, for everyone's information, that's the enabling piece of legislation for the Queensland Police Force in the road policing command activities that they carry out throughout the state. And that covers any number of things from, driving under the influence to use of mobile phones and other infringements on the roads. The TORUM currently requires the police to actually carry out all of the activities specified in what is referred to as Transport Acts. And currently in the schedule to that Act, the Transport Operation Passenger Transport Act is not referred to or not identified as a specific Transport Act. We're seeking an amendment to that particular schedule to include TOPTA, which includes the licensing of taxis. And the reason why is in the absence, that is one area where the Queensland Police Service, who we believe should have been involved by now, have been able to successfully argue the case that there is no specific legislative pointer that requires them to carry this work out, whereas that schedule does refer to the Land Transport Act, which deals with yellow lines and parking or indicating too close to an intersection and the road rules. It does refer to other sections of TORUMs and a couple of other acts dealing with ferries and that sort of thing.
Okay, and your submission also, you put forward the view that Uber's not paying GST and that they possibly should. Can you tell us about that? So
under the GST legislation, during the process of negotiating it, one of the things that the government sought to do was to address what they considered black holes or remnants of the cash economy. And taxis were considered to be one of the last bastions of the cash economy. So in bringing the legislation about, they provided a $75,000 exemption for all small businesses with the exception of taxi drivers, because they believed that the taxi drivers would be seeking, or the taxi industry sought to not pay taxes. So they tightened the legislation. They said if you want to work in the taxi industry as a driver, you have to register for GST from the first dollar that you earn. So no exemption actually exists. If, as well as that, you carry out other businesses, those other businesses you must declare and apply GST to every dollar earned on that as well. What we're saying is, and we agree with the tax office ruling on ride sourcing, which is effectively if you're offering a vehicle for hire, regardless of how you get to that vehicle, that's what we're going to call a taxi service. It's our definition, not necessarily a position defined by different state governments. And I mean, as many of you would know, tax law often follows its own path, and that can be set as precedent regardless of what different states and territories may choose to do. This is one of those instances, and they've said that this is how we're going to apply it. GST should be applied. Currently, from the 1st of July, there's a ruling, 1st of August this year, there's a ruling that actually requires all Uber drivers to be registered and apply GST, but Uber has challenged that in the federal court. And what's occurring as a result of that is you've got people who are offering taxi services who are not paying GST. Notwithstanding what the court outcome is, ATO rulings have the full force of federal law until such time as the court overturns it, which makes it quite a different policy creature to what other policy areas in state and federal government is. The tax office actually has a lot more power than many other agencies.
Yeah, Benjamin. Just, I note what you said there in regards to the amendments in regards to strengthening, you know, the more or less police involvement. Do you see that the department is more or less too relaxed in regards to the illegal taxi driving as Uber as in general?
Look, to be honest with you, I think the department under the former minister and this minister up until July this year were doing their job and doing it well. What the legislation, as I said earlier, could not anticipate was a business model that actively sought to subvert compliance activity. That actually, you know, a business, if it's genuinely believing that it's doing the right thing, then bring along your enforcement, I'll challenge it in court and I'll follow a normal court procedure and we'll abide by the rule of the referee. By actively thwarting compliance and enforcement activity, that they've gone down a very different path. I wouldn't say that the department's relaxed. I would say that the department have become overwhelmed. I don't think that they've ever had to really contend with this sort of thing before. That really does move into a completely different realm of law enforcement, something that is better placed with the Queensland Police Service to deal with organisations that actively seek to avoid the law. That's a very different skill set. And I'll give credit where credit's due. I don't think the department's been relaxed about it. And I'm not even saying that the government's been relaxed about it, but I certainly don't think there have been enough resources applied to understanding how it could be better enforced.
Ben, could you talk me through how taxis provide services to people with a disability and whether Uber provides the same?
Okay, so we've got the Disability Discrimination Act. It's a federal piece of legislation, been around some 20 years, and subordinate to that act are the Disability Standards for Accessible Public Transport. Our legislation in Queensland requires people who offer for-hire vehicles to comply with the disability standards for accessible public transport, with the exception of limousines or hire cars. So what that effectively means is you've got to be able to provide an equal level of service. So if you've got to pick up a minimum service level that says, I'm going to pick up Mr. Wash in 15 minutes, within 15 minutes in off-peak times, then a person who has a disability must be picked up, in the same time frame. Now, how that translates within a fleet of taxis is it means that you have to provide enough wheelchair accessible services so that when someone does order a vehicle, that they've got an equal chance of getting something in the same time frame. If you have too few, then you're in a position where you can't actually offer that service. In fact, if you only have one vehicle in a fleet, if it's occupied, you can't guarantee any level of service beyond that. Obviously, given the operating costs of such vehicles are substantially greater because of the modifications that they have to undertake, there's a question of commercial viability. So the fleet is continually trying to gauge what is the appropriate level. Is it 1 in 4 cars that we need to have? Is it 1 in 5? The Queensland taxi industry has approximated 1 in 5 across the state. And to put that in perspective, that's around 2 in 100 in New York City, which is considered to be one of the greatest markets of taxis. So we really are, providing a service 10 times the level of many other taxi industries that we may be compared to. The current services, as I understand it with Uber, is that they are sitting outside of the disability standards for accessible public transport. So notwithstanding what representations they might make about the sort of service that they are, there's actually no obligation to do so. And in the event that they don't provide such service, there's no recourse to an agency or anyone else. There is a possibility for an anti-discrimination course to be brought to bear, but I think the sheer size and wealth of Uber as an organisation would be far too intimidating for the average punter to try and make a representation to protect themselves, because they'd fear being crushed by the court system and being bankrupted by a wealthy multinational.
Oh, I'm just listening. It's very interesting.
You got any more questions, Shane?
Just in regards to it was mentioned there previously about it's a criminal offence in other countries And I don't think the previous taxi driver referred to want to see this happening, but is that the feeling of the taxi industry towards the Uber drivers who are driving illegal taxis?
Look, as an industry, I can say that we certainly feel frustration. There's a lot of, we're not understanding how this is happening. But look, I think you'd find that within the industry, if you break it down to the individual owners, operators and drivers, they don't bear any particular malice towards people. If someone's been deceived into carrying out an illegal activity or engaging in criminal activity, if it's defined that way, I don't think that they would be seeking to see that person thrashed because they were deceived into a situation that compromised them and the community. What we just want to see is legislation that is robust, that delivers the things it needs to deliver, and it's done on a level playing field. We're not here to discuss, this bill isn't about discussing the philosophical structure of the industry. A whole review has been set up to do that, and it's resourced, and we will collaborate and contribute to that. This is really about the existing laws and saying, well, our penalty regime has failed. It needs to be upheld. We would not like to see suspension of the existing penalties within the industry, much less to anyone who may be operating on the fringes of the industry. So I would say that from what I understand, the industry bears no particular malice, and we don't want to see people charged with criminal charges just because. We just want to see them being educated. A first and final warning with a fine would maybe be appropriate, but I certainly think that there needs to be demerits associated with it, partly because it's not the individual who's bearing the cost of those fines. That's what makes this fundamentally different. There's been a situation a few years ago in Toowoomba, it was reported in the papers, where at graduation time of year, operators of restored veteran vehicles were offering for hire those vehicles for young graduates to go to their high school graduation, that sort of thing. And the same for the universities. Now, they were operating outside of all of the legal frameworks, and the Transport and Main Roads Department wrote to them and explained the situation. There was community outrage, and these people went to the papers, but in actual fact, Transport stood their dig and they just said, look, happy for you to lobby to have some sort of suspension of the rules in future, but at this point in time, they're the rules, they're there for very good reasons, and we're prepared to argue that case. That's on an individual basis, and whether people like it or not, Queenslanders are happy to accept the rule of law. The dynamics completely change when you've got someone who has operated brashly internationally and stood up to the might of governments and has a huge arsenal behind them. So that changes the whole dynamic. That's why demerits are necessary, because the individual might be deceived, they come in, they carry it out. The individual in most circumstances could be told you're doing the wrong thing and a penalty will apply, and that will stop them. But in this case, the individual is emboldened because they've got a machine behind them that's saying, don't worry about it, carry on. I'll take care of that for you. So we need to break the nexus between the activity that's being carried out by the person, the organisation that's creating this deception and prepared to finance the ongoing activity for its own profit, and the individual. We need to now make the individual, this is all about actually making the individual responsible to their actions.
Benjamin, I'll ask that you accept my apology if I get the language wrong, because I'm not an accountant. But I'm just a little bit interested in the money that a taxi owner would take as part of collecting fares, paying GST and all that sort of thing. Would you have any understanding of what the difference between what you guys have got to go through, or the taxi operators have got to go through, up against what Uber drivers would have to go through with regard to declaring monies that they might take and pay out?
Sure.
Do you understand that? Well,
just on a fair-by-fair basis?
Yep.
Like on an individual fare?
Well, I want to know if you guys are really, you're in a position where you have to pay.
That's exactly right.
I want to know if the other group, Uber, are in a situation where we actually know how much those people are taking and where's it going to, who's paying GST, who's paying taxation.
Yeah. Okay. So this actually comes back to, again, with any licensing regime, part of the reason the government licenses or creates a licence is so that it can regulate other aspects of the operation of that business. And one of the things that's regulated within that is the taximeter. So taximeters now are very, very sophisticated pieces of equipment that go back and send a lot of information back to data dispatch systems, and those dispatch systems capture a whole heap of things. They're hooked up with toll systems so that there's a certain amount of revenue that is collected when someone decides to go through a toll. There's GST applied to that. If someone chooses to pay my merchant, all merchant services, contrary to popular belief, third-party merchants who are suppliers of merchant services to the industry. They're not part of the industry. They don't direct policy within the industry. So any additional charges that are attributable to the fare, they're collected as well. The meter issues an invoice, and this came about as changes in 2013 in collaboration with Transport and Main Roads to tighten up the level of disclosure that was available on receipts for each of the fares. There's now a requirement to split out all of those different items. That's available through the meter. It goes back through the operator software. It goes through the dispatch software. All of that information is auditable, and all of that information under tax law would be disclosable to the tax office. I think it's worth noting, in addition to that though, that anything up to 30% of any given fare is actually revenue collection for a third party. And because those charges are added on and charged at the point of sale, we often wear the bad press that comes with being the tax collector of a third party. They get the benefit of it, and we wear the bad press. It's not a bad business model if you're a third party using taxis to collect your revenue on your behalf. Those things are quite distinct from a platform that does ostensibly all the same things. The instrument that is the mobile phone, and no matter how Uber wants to try and paint it, it's operating as a meter as defined by Queensland law. I won't speak to the rest of the world or the rest of the nation. I'm unaware of what level of disclosure and breakdown that is. Because it's an offshore company and the transactions are processed offshore, I'm unaware what level of disclosure that you could reasonably accept. The only thing I can talk to is a commentary that came out of the Standing Committee on Economics held by the Senate recently, where at best you could say that the companies who were asked to attend just obfuscated everything that's going on. There were no clear answers coming out. There are governments around the world who have ordered with substantial fines to be paid to deliver up certain information, because policy is only going to be as good as the information that you can base it on. There's no evidence that you're going to get that information. So what I can say is what we give you is very detailed, it's auditable, and we're not trying to hide anything from anyone. I'm certain that there may have been an element of people in the industry who subsequently left when GST came in because they weren't happy with that level of disclosure, but that's long since gone.
So I'll form my own conclusions.
It's a long answer basically to say
no, that's
I don't know what you can get out of them, and I don't know how to translate.
One more question.
I'll just pull you back to the bill, Ben, and the demerit points. Your submission talks about the rule of law, and you've already expressed that you maybe think the rule of law has not been applied sufficiently at the minute, and from the evidence that we've heard before, I think it has slowed down. But if the department said to us that they were having trouble catching people, so how is increasing the demerit points, if we can't catch them, how is increasing the demerit points going to help? And I just want to be the devil's advocate for a second.
Sure. This is why we've recommended the amendment. The amendment would mean that you're applying police resources to actually capture them.
Right.
The demerits is to heighten the awareness of the individual of the gravity of the sort of thing that they're doing, the illegal activity they're doing. I know that in some of the submissions that there's they state that there's a general premise that demerits are applied for safety reasons. That's not necessarily the case, because demerits are equally applied for any number of different infringements, including failing to show an L plate or a green P plate, or these aren't safety issues per se, but demerits have been applied because penalties weren't considered sufficient. So demerits in and of themselves will not improve things. I'll give you that much. But demerits with appropriate enforcement, will make the difference that is necessary. Because even if you bring enforcement in without the demerits, where the individual has to bear the responsibility of their actions, then you can enforce it, and all you're going to do is create a new government revenue stream where millions of dollars are going to be poured in by a multinational. And I don't really think that's the purpose of the legislation. Government isn't there to be a revenue raiser. It's not a commercial venture. It's there to provide the frameworks for what we consider to be a well-regulated and well-governed society.
Yeah.
Queensland is that. I'd hate to see us go backwards.
Just to clarify, we're talking about double demerit points in this case.
On the second offence, yes.
So are you saying that without the amendments, maybe this won't work?
It really comes down to compliance. Any piece of legislation will come down to compliance and an agency's ability to actually enforce the current legislation. Just one final point as far as double demerits go. Recently, the government sought to implement laws where mobile phones, use of the mobile phone attracted 3 demerit points, and second offence attracted double demerits. In this particular instance, the vast majority of illegal taxi work is done through interaction of a mobile phone. So I don't think that we're actually moving from, in terms of philosophy, we're not shifting very far from that piece of legislation. And that was a particular reason why the bill was put up on that basis, because you can't divorce the two.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Benjamin. Time has expired.
Thank you very much.
No more further questions to yourself. I now call yellow cabs. Welcome.
Welcome.
Yeah, welcome, Bill. Would you please state your name for the record, please, and position?
My name is Bill Parker. I'm the General Manager of Yellow Cabs Queensland Proprietary Limited.
Opening statement?
Well, my opening statement is that before Uber and other illegal taxi operations were out there, I don't believe the taxi industry in this state was broken. It didn't need fixing. It need work on it, as it does. It's an ongoing process. I have an issue with government when it doesn't want to take action. I don't believe it has taken sufficient action. I have an issue when it says that what are they doing in Victoria and New South Wales. I have an issue because the taxi industry in this state is a leader of the industry, and that needs to be recognised. And I think it has very good work practice, and it's been very innovative in working with government in the past. The Act, which was written in 1994, wasn't written yesterday. It was based upon issues that became apparent to government at the time to protect the community. In 1994, I was around, and I played a role in helping the government put that Act together. I'm equally disappointed because people who were in government have failed to even read it. So they sit in a position of adjudication, but they have no knowledge of it. We have these illegal taxi operations. They're very trendy. People like it. Well, they probably like it because it's cheap. And I don't know, there are some people who would say, well, that could represent votes. And in that case, I'm very disappointed. So from Yellow Cab's perspective, we played a very involved role with government in helping identify issues that needed to be incorporated in the current Act, and we've had a good working relationship. There are a lot of people in our organisation that have been in the industry a long time. It has a greater knowledge of what a driver or drivers can get up to bend the rules, and to endanger public. For example, in the Act, it has a thing about fatigue management. It implies that the operator of the vehicle has to have a fatigue management policy. Well, that's all very well and good. The taxi industry, or particularly Yellow Cabs, in its dispatch software, it incorporates a fatigue management calculator to ensure that that driver is not exceeding certain hours, otherwise it logs him out of the system. It also has, in its involvement with the department and recognising accident risk and problems associated with drivers driving not only excessive hours but having poor driving records, that it has developed a defensive driving course that it incorporates in its training. It interests me that one of the subsequent speakers here is the RACQ. Well, the RACQ, we have a contract with that if we identify a driver who's at risk because of poor driving standards, we send, and they don't change those, despite our counselling. The driver, we send them over to the RACQ, who put them through a course. So I think it's very important that that is a level playing field, and I think it's very important the government recognise that the taxi service out there requires supplies a safe and secure service. I don't believe that it's just Uber that we have a problem with. Uber has showed that every other entrepreneur out there that that there's no compliance necessary, that the government isn't doing its job, that the police aren't doing their job. So we now have fleets of cars out there advertising, handing out their own phone cards and developing their own client base. And that's a risk. It's a risk to the consumer. If we as a company are worried about poor driver standards or poor driver behaviour, why shouldn't these people be? And why shouldn't they be held accountable? There have been 2 rapes. They don't get much, 2 rapes in our society. One was at Rockhampton. The car was sitting on the back of a rank, unidentified. This young lady got into the car, and she suffered as a result of it. There was another one, not recently, in Petrie Terrace. Once again, the girl got into an unidentified vehicle.
Yeah, well, I'm not sure where those cases might be, and if there's any chance they could be before the courts or anything. You know, we're not in a position to start talking about it. So.
Well, I'm not talking about it. I'm just making a statement.
Yeah, well, I'm saying I don't want you talking about it, if that's okay.
Okay,
move on to other things.
Well, what I'm trying to... My point is that the industry recognises the possibility of those situations occurring, and it does something about it.
Okay, Michael.
So, Bill, do you have the same opinion as the previous submitter that the enforcement is not actually happening at the minute? And what's your opinion about enforcement and how will that work with double demerit points?
Well, the previous speaker is a little bit more gentle than I am. I think you're in the Queensland Transport Department's their enforcement tries to figure out ways and means how not to do their job rather than do it. I approached officers in the department and said, if you have problems with your phones being locked out, we're happy to work with you and show you how it can be done. And their response to that was, no, that's collusion, therefore we're not going to do it. So I think that this whole scenario has shown a lack of will. And for whatever reason, I don't want to care to comment on, obviously, but I think there is a distinct lack of will. Section 27 of the Act, Section 7 of the Act clearly define that it's an illegal operation. I was here for the previous hearing, and the woman that stood up here and said she didn't know whether they were illegal or otherwise, well, that's a laughable statement to make. And in fact, I believe that Uber itself is in breach of the criminal code. That's my legal opinion that I have on my desk, because they're inciting others to break the law.
Would you be in a position to make that available to the committee?
Sure.
That's legal opinion?
Yep.
Thank you very much.
Well, I have to get consent from...
Oh, for sure.
Of course, but I will.
Yes, thanks, Bill.
Bill, I sense your frustration there in regards to the role that the Transport Department's taken here. We're seeing now Uber, while we've got this inquiry taken place in regards to demerit points, and now we're seeing Uber actually advertise to spread further aboard right to Cairns. So do you feel that you know, they've really taking the government and maybe the committee and the transport department for granted because they feel that they're going to have, the way they're going, they're having a win-win-win and no one's really going to do anything. So we're going to, you know, continue on to pursue this because they believe that they're going to win on this.
Well, I can't speak for you, but I know that they treat you with contempt. And I think that they tell lies and people accept them. They don't. And how can you ask about how efficient they run or et cetera, if they don't make, they don't have need to disclose that. The cab industry does that. It does it every quarter. It sends its details, all its data to the department so it can assess how well the industry is going. It has been said, and I don't know where this came from, that they're not really interested in large areas, in small country towns. Well, the fact is they're now advertising in Rockhampton. They have been for some time looking for Uber operatives. I don't think they care where these operators turn up. But there should be a word of warning to government because we're involved in some of these country towns, and I know how difficult those people are operating, what a downturn because of the mining sector they're experiencing financially. If there's a Uber operation or a lookalike operation starts up in those towns, they will suffer. And the public rely upon them. I think the other thing that needs to be identified is that the cab industry is not just about taking money from somebody for providing a service. It plays it has a footprint in that community. In supplying the disabled community, for a start, that's a footprint. They develop a relationship with those people. They're out there 24/7. When the cyclone hit Yeppoon, I'm sure you all read, maybe you're not, but I'll remind you that it was the cab industry that was driving around out there. They volunteered to do this, picking up people at their houses and taking them to safe havens. So they played that role. They're out there 24/7. They need the good times to subsidise the bad times. They're out there at 4 a.m. in the morning and they could be there for 3 hours and not get no demand. But they accept that as part of the process of being in the cab industry or working in that community. So when busy night comes along, well, they can cross-subsidise their operational costs. So sitting on your hands and not saying, well, Uber, who only wants to pick the eyes out of it, or these other operators pick the eyes out of it and say, well, I can earn a few dollars on the side here, to their detriment, is to the detriment of the community, in truth. So I'm very worried about some of those country areas, to answer your question. I'm very close to the people in Yeppoon. I'm close to Rockhampton. I'm close to Warwick. We also look after Tully and Magnetic Island, huge cab areas, but nevertheless, there's nobody in the cab industry in this state that isn't worried. There is nobody who isn't concerned.
Just one more question, Bill, in regards to that concern. I did speak to a taxi driver there recently who was saying that, you know, he's got a $500,000 licence, but he said there's no superannuation he puts into. He believes that taxi licence was going to be his super, so that this is basically his life savings. Do you see that as very similar? Is that what you're seeing?
I do. I think that it's interesting that the cab industry developed its own goodwill. That $500,000 is goodwill. If he wants to sell his business as a small business operator, he's developed the goodwill. Our government in the past have benefited by the goodwill that cab drivers have developed. Now the goodwill changes from city to city and country town to country town. So the goodwill in Rockhampton could be $200,000, and the goodwill down the Gold Coast, as he said, was $500,000. Well, it's based upon what you want to pay to buy a small business. In the past, when the government's tendered for existing new licences for an area, and the last one I remember they tendered for was in Yeppoon, they put it to public tender. They gladly accepted the money that the person who won that tender offered to provide the service. The government gladly accept whenever there's a change of ownership of a licence, the stamp duty that goes with it. It's a form of taxation as well, I guess. And It's a significant amount, which is part of the process. So over a great period of time, there's been a lot of extra licences issued by government when they've decided that an area needs additional licences, and they benefited by it. And I think that this legislation needs to be tabled, because if it isn't, I think it's against the democracy of this place. To say that it's not worthy to be discussed on the floor is an affront to the democratic process. Because there's a lot of people, in my rough account, there's over 60,000 are very concerned about the future. And someone who has built up that goodwill is rightfully concerned about what goes down. Some people have paid for it. And I can tell you a number of people who are currently in dire straits. I can tell you a gentleman who's got dementia, whose family borrowed some money, and he was the sole breadwinner driving this cab, and he now has to sell the licence for the family, 2 boys to go to university. Well, they can't sell it. We have another one where a similar case where the person has to go into a home and the family need to sell the licence to get him into this home. Now they're selling the family the house to get them in. There's a gentleman who had cancer, and he wanted to sell his licence so that he could leave his family in good stead on his departure from this world. He's already passed on. The licence is still there. So are these people, they're not faceless people, they're out there. They're being attacked. They haven't done anything wrong. I don't think it's unjust to ask that the government does its job and uphold the laws of the state. It is a rule of law, and I think the Queensland Police Service should play a role in it. And I don't see how they have a right, by the way, to say that we're going to pick and choose which laws of this state we're going to uphold.
Lachlan?
Bill, just going back to small country towns, do you feel there'll be even issues in where I come from, such as Emerald and Longreach, where a taxi service is more of a community obligation and done well by the Tanks family and the Hooper family? Do you see that this could be an issue there as well?
Well, I can answer that by telling you out at Roma there is an illegal taxi operator out there, you know, Chrysler 300C. And the person in Roma, they've told the department on numerous occasions about this fellow hangs around the pubs and takes work out from underneath them. And does the department do anything about it? No. Is that operator part of the Uber system? No. But is he a copycat of the Uber system? Yep. So this isn't just about Uber. This is about anybody out there who thinks that they can defeat the law, work underneath the law, don't have to apply the law, or don't be held accountable by the law. So it's a big issue. And to answer your question, I say yes, it is an issue, because Uber aren't going to knock back someone in Emerald deciding to operate and give Ben a hard time. Now I know Ben quite well, and I know he spends an inordinate amount of time getting up at some ungodly hour in the morning to ensure someone gets from point A to point B, or to the local doctor's surgery if they've got an issue. And will he be upset? Yes, he will. Will he come and tell you? I'm sure he will.
Brittany?
Bill, I was wondering if you could talk me through the security and safety features of taxis in Queensland and how Uber compare.
Okay, well, the first thing is that Uber use an app on a phone. So if they turn it off, then there's no track and trace. In the cab industry, we have 3 GPS units in the car, so we know exactly where that car is at any given time, anywhere in this state. Even if they turn their system off, we can still tell you where that car is. We introduced that because of the circumstances surrounding the safety of a driver. We've had drivers who've been held up at gunpoint and disappear outside our current system of dispatch, which is all done through two-way radios. So we now link that system in with the Telstra 3G system. So if they go outside of our radio range, we pick them up via the Telstra system. That's number one. Number two, we cross-reference data with DTMR every 24 hours regarding their licence being still valid, whether they've been charged with a criminal offence, drink driving offence, or Spur have caught up with them with unpaid fines. That's automatically done. As for, I mentioned fatigue management before, it's the same thing. We collate their hours accumulative over a 24-hour period and won't let them log back in. All that, in real terms, is in favour of the community, the people we carry. If you look at a yellow cab, for example, it's done up like a big, I don't know what sort of lolly it is, one of those...
Jaffa.
Yeah, Jaffa. They're not hard, they're very easy to see, and the fleet numbers on them are very large too. Now, the size of those fleet numbers was achieved through consultation with the government of the day to ensure that the public knew, before they got in the cab, what fleet number they had, what they were getting into. The fleet number on the windscreen, the fleet number on the back of it, the fleet number on the bonnet is all about public safety. They could drive around in an unmarked car so you don't know who you're going to get in with. At least we want the public to realise that it is a safe and secure service, and we go to a lot of trouble to make sure it is. Hence, if you do get into a car and you get into trouble and the driver has turned his iPhone off, well, how can you track and trace him? And I think if you ask the Queensland Police Service how much they've been assisted by the cab industry in helping them investigate certain issues, I'm sure the working policeman will give us a big tick of approval, because our system is far in excess or exceeds their system, and we lodge all the journeys, which way they went, how fast the car was going, etc., etc. Once again, if we take away the opportunity for a driver to abuse the system because we're not looking, they all know that if someone rings up and said this car was driving in excess speed down the freeway, we can look it up and say you're right or you're wrong, and it's very much part of the system. It's linking the meter to the computer system as well, the dispatch, and I think that there isn't a driver that I'm aware of who isn't proud of the fact that there's always this ongoing overseeing of their to their benefit, because it works both ways. The cameras were mentioned before. Well, the government have issued an edict that they've got to replace those cameras and have voice with them, and they've got a couple of years to do it. I can tell you right now that not too many of them are spending the money to do that. It costs $3,800. Do those cameras stop people from abusing the cab driver? No. They stop them from punching him or stealing from him? No. Are they good for the Queensland Police Service when they ring up and say, can you do a download? They definitely are. So that's part of our position in the society we work in. And we accept that and work with them. We have systems where we try and get the drivers to develop relationships with the people they pick up and carry. And that's no greater evidence of that than in Yeppoon, where the local drivers become very much part of the community. The same with Ben Hooper up in Emerald, and the drivers in Bundaberg, who are doing it very tough at this point in time as well because of the floods and downturn in the community. So it just comes back. If government doesn't want to do anything, then this industry will have a huge problem. And I think there will be repercussions of a very broad section of the community.
Thanks, Bill. Before you go, I just want to clear up a little bit of a misunderstanding we had. Look, anybody's more than everybody's invited to talk about the safety issues which you were doing, but we just can't accept any discussion on specific cases. And I have a role to make sure that the committee is shielded from all that as well. So thanks very much for your input. Much appreciated.
I just want to make a point. It needs to be a level playing field. And I think there is a need to protect an industry. There's nothing wrong with it. And that it deserves that protection. And if this is the only way to do it, because Uber seem to be able to bluff their way through a system, if France, they can make it illegal, The drivers over there burnt the cars. That sort of got some
Well, we don't want
action.
to go that far.
No, we don't. They punched a couple of drivers out here in Brisbane, and the police went and caught the drivers. They would not have been able to catch those drivers without the assistance of the industry.
Okay.
It doesn't want that.
I don't think there's a lot of benefit in just targeting Uber, though, in this whole discussion. The whole thing needs to be about the taxi industry and illegal taxi industries, and that's what we need to be talking about.
I totally agree. And I can tell you that even Uber should be worried, because if there's 400 illegal Uber cars in this Brisbane area, I would be reasonably assured there would be 400 other vehicles that doing the same thing, and they're getting around, picking up hails, and no one can account for them.
Thanks, Bill.
Can I just say one more
We're
word?
out of time, mate, and I've got to be fair to everybody else. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, Bill.
My pleasure.
Okay, now black and white taxis, please.
Thanks.
For the record, gentlemen, could you please state your names and positions?
Sure. Greg Webb, Managing Director of Black and White Cabs.
Paul Melville, Director of Black and White Cabs.
You can just, no,
Paul Melville, Director of
sorry,
Black and White
Paul,
Cabs.
you can pull it around so you haven't got to lean forward, mate, that's all.
I'm not planning on saying much, Jim.
Thanks.
Here to hold his hand.
Okay. Greg, you've got an opening statement, man?
I have, Jim. Yeah, thank you. Firstly, thanks for the invitation to present and to talk on our submission. Just a little bit about Black and White Cabs. We're a service provider to the taxi industry in 4 locations in Australia: Brisbane, Perth, Toowoomba, and Redcliffe. Under our affiliation, there's 1,400 taxis in total. We have some 4,000 taxi drivers affiliated with our company. We've got over 200 staff, and our business is a formation of a company that goes back to 1918 in Ascot Cabs and Blue and White taxis. We're very happy to support the bill, and we certainly do in its amended form as put forward by Taxi Council. The taxi industry is regulated in Queensland, and the government has issued a cease and desist notice to Uber particularly. There are other illegal taxi operators as we've identified, but there has been a cease and desist notice issued to Uber. There's been fines issued to Uber to Uber drivers and other drivers. There's been fines that have been paid, which is an admission of guilt, and I think that's an important element to be dealing with. These drivers are operating without a taxi licence. They're operating without the correct compulsory third-party insurance, and they're also, in most cases, operating without the correct driver's authorisation. Despite Uber's spin on things, there is a downturn in work for the taxi industry. It's quite evident and biting quite hard as we speak today. The amount of work that Uber publicise that they're enjoying is somewhat comparable to the downturn in the taxi industry and the work that we're seeing in decline, and we think that's an important element, that the work they say is growing the market. We don't see it as growing the market. We see it as just stealing from our industry, which is regulated and legal. We also see that there's perhaps a class emerging from the Uber operations and other rideshare type operations of a poor working class. We see that in various literature around the world, and we're mindful that that might be happening in Australia. What we see that these rideshare people do is they work in the area of the taxi industry. They are taking away the low-hanging fruit. They're certainly cherry-picking the business that is the easy business, the inner-city business, the nightclub business. They're not expanding themselves out to areas of the outer areas. They don't have to work 24/7. There's certainly no assistance to the disabled community of any notice. Elderly, the frail, and as I said, the outer areas of the taxi industry. And the industry has been quite disaffected. Just looking a little bit further forward, we are currently in a review process, and I commend Premier Anastasia Palaszczuk and the Minister and Transport Minister Jackie Trad on the commissioning of the review. It's underway. Personalised transport services is going to be a very detailed review. I've already met with Jim Bargheese, the chair of the review. We've opened our books, we've opened our business to his review process. We've already provided him with some data and financial information, and we see this review as very important to the taxi industry and in fact to all Queenslanders, provided it's done in a very collaborative way. We're seeing that Jim's, in the outset, that's his approach to that. As far as the immediate position, we see that these rideshare operators are operating illegally. We need to stem the damage that they are doing to our industry while the review, the collaborative review, goes underway. We need to do something now, and this bill is very much supported by us. What's happening is that the drivers of these illegal taxis are operating with the mindset that there's no inhibitor to them to stop their illegal practice, because Uber are paying the fines or passing the money over to them to pay the fines, so there's no detriment to them to keep going with their illegal activities. In addition to that, new drivers are joining this group because they see there's nothing going on. When they see the inaction, they then say, well, we can do this as well, and they're joining in, and that's why it's growing. And if you look at pricing, you look at the differentiation in pricing between a regulated industry and the cost of regulation and the safety features and the service features that fit around that regulation, and you look at a unregulated business, the costs are much lower, and we've spoken about those before as an industry, but right now the public are leaning towards a low-cost solution to personalised public transport, but it's unregulated and it doesn't have the shackles of cost regulations that we have through licensing and through regulation. So the immediate measures that I see are required are to continue on with the review, but in the short term we need to make sure that the compliance activity by our officers gives us this transitional period to design the new personalised public transport system for the future. But in the meantime, all the mums and dads and families associated with the taxi industry are protected to some degree, or certainly the law is enforced to make sure that the taxi industry and others comply by the law. I note that the addition to the legislation that will involve the police, I think that's paramount. The Police Assistant Commissioner Mike Keating, in a meeting with us, said we've got no appetite for this, and he was referring to the compliance measures against the illegal taxis. It seems the police themselves are looking for more empowerment, and this bill will deliver that, and we want that to occur. So in summary, in my opening remarks, rideshare services are illegal, and I think that's proven. The taxi industry is being disaffected. There is a welcome review underway with personalised public transport, but this bill needs to be implemented and enforced so the relevant laws and that currently stand are upheld.
Thanks, Greg. Did you have anything to
No,
add
nothing,
to
Jim.
that? You talked about the review again. So the review is about the taxi industry.
No, the review is covering the personalised public transport. So in a nutshell, there's three elements to that. There's taxi industry, limousine industry and rideshare.
So rideshare becomes part of that review?
Correct.
Okay. In your submission, you made a statement, and I'll have to read it, I'm sorry. ADO has decided Uber drivers are providing taxi service and must charge GST no matter the turnover. Prior to this, lost revenue for government appears that the Uber has adopted taxation minimisation strategy. What do you mean by that?
Okay, so the there is a threshold for GST payments in Australia of $75,000. The taxi industry does not have that threshold, and it has to pay GST from a zero income base or $1 income base. What we're seeing with Uber is, once again, they have got a price advantage where they're not charging the public GST, so they're not adding that onto their fare. The Government of Australia is not collecting that tax revenue. State of Queensland benefits from that tax revenue. So we're seeing a complete avoidance of the tax laws because they're saying they're not a taxi service when they're in fact providing a taxi service.
Okay. Would you be able to give us a summary on what you see has happened to the industry since we've had Uber take a stronghold here in Brisbane?
Sure. Well, we operate, I think I said to you, we operate 200 taxis ourselves, so I day-to-day see taxi takings. I'm talking to drivers all the time. I'm very close to the industry. So, in a sense, we're seeing it being hit in three different ways. Firstly, taxi drivers are being disaffected by the fact that their income levels are dropping, and that's borne out by dispatch system data. We're seeing our number of bookings decline. We're seeing our dispatch systems are quite unique in that they can also measure the number of hails that happen on the street. So hail and rank information we can see as well, and we're seeing that decline as well. So taxi drivers are seeing a loss of income. Secondly, a taxi operator. Normally there's about a 50-50 split between revenues between a taxi driver and a taxi operator. There's certain deals that are done between taxi operators and taxi drivers. They're all commercial arrangements, but in principle it's about a 50-50 relationship. So rolling on from that is there's a decline to the taxi operator as well. So the taxi operator is responsible for all the costs of running the taxi. He's responsible for the car. He's responsible for all the compliance costs of government, licence fees, operator accreditation, cameras, rah rah rah. So he's seeing a decline in income as well. So then the knock-on effect to that is now to taxi licence owners. So some of those licence owners are landlord-type investors. Some are very much hands-on in the industry. So you're seeing now a decline in income to the taxi licence owner by the taxi operator having to drop the price of the licence lease to be able to remain viable. So right through the knock-on is going right through our industry.
And that's fair comment. How do you factor in the economic conditions as they are at the moment? Because it's very obvious that the state is struggling.
Okay.
So you must be able to be fair income.
Yes.
You have to be able to factor that in.
Sure. Look, we are certainly taking into account that there is an economic downturn in our industry, and that there's certain areas of the industry, less so in tourism now, but more so in particularly the city areas and some of the regional areas through mining and that. So I use the example of the Sunshine Coast. I'm privileged as a board member. I was privileged to data for the Sunshine Coast. Up until recently, there was no Uber involvement on the Sunshine Coast. And I can look at their data and say, okay, how is the Sunshine Coast going compared to Brisbane? So what is the change here? So I look at the Sunshine Coast and I see, and I won't quote numbers because it would be inappropriate, but I see either a flatness of revenue compared to last year, or a small decline. I go to Brisbane, I see no flatness, I see a decline or a large decline. So when I take into account one is Brisbane, so the economy is causing the Sunshine Coast to be sort of flat line, and Brisbane we're seeing a large decline. So when I measure that way, also we can look at the data throughout the state from our all taxi companies, has been previously told to you, reports on a quarterly basis, and you can see the trending going on there with taxi bookings quite readily.
Okay, thank you very much.
I just want to go back to the Chair's question about GST. And I see on page 12 of your submission that you've said from August 1, all Uber drivers are now required to obtain ABNs and register for GST, and that the ATO has decided Uber drivers are providing a taxi service. Has the ATO made are you aware, has the ATO made a tax ruling on this that applies specifically to Uber?
I'm not sure if it's a tax ruling or they're enforcing the legislation and as a policy of describing a rideshare driver as a taxi driver. But that's been challenged. That's been challenged legally by Uber, and to my knowledge, they have not complied with that ruling or decision by the tax office.
Okay, so it may well be a general ride-sharing ruling. And this is a question I'll ask Uber later.
Sure, it's a terminology thing, and I think the tax office has ascribed ride-sharing as taxi. It comes under taxi services.
Okay, so in your submission also you were talking about that the community may bear the cost in the taxi industry if Uber drivers are involved in an accident and are underinsured. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what your thoughts are on the insurance situation between taxi industry and rideshare industry?
Okay, if I just talk about CTP and the protection that the community has from CTP in Queensland, there's a safety net in it which is called the nominal defendant. So everyone who pays registration in Queensland pays towards the nominal defendant scheme. So if you look at an Uber driver or a rideshare driver who's out there not with the correct insurance and they're found to be operating with an accident where a passenger was injured during that accident, then the entitlement would be for the insurance company to decline the claim, but then the government or under the CTP rules that would be picked up under the nominal defendant rules. Then the nominal defendant, who's an entity, would then be able to sue the Uber driver if the Uber driver didn't have the capacity to pay, and some of these claims in CTP, as we all know, are extremely high. If the Uber driver didn't have the capacity to pay, then that would be left with the Commonwealth under the nominal defendant scheme. So we're saying that's a cost to community if CTP is not of the same standard 3 that we have as a taxi industry.
I'll just take one more question, Brittany.
Yeah, sure. This might be, one of the things I'm really interested in is the app being, it seems, the lifeblood of the whole Uber service.
Mm-hmm.
And the Apple Store guidelines, the App Store guidelines, the legal requirements, item 22.1 in the legal requirements specifies that apps must comply with all legal requirements in any location where they are made available to users. And I just wondered if the taxi industry, and maybe there's a role for government to play here, had made any complaint or reported the non-compliance with the legal requirements in the App Store.
Yeah, well, I don't know whether complaints have been made. I know the industry has investigated Uber's ability to access the net, number one, to advertise its illegal services, number two, with Apple and with Google, Android-type products. All those have been investigated, but there's been a pushback by the suppliers, the Apple and others, to say, we need to provide legal evidence. There's a lot of work for us to do in a federal sphere as well, not just in a state sphere.
Maybe perhaps government and maybe we could help with that too.
Yep. But we would welcome that if that could be done. Yes.
Well, thanks very much. Time has expired, unfortunately.
Yeah. Just to close it, I'd be welcome to. I'd welcome the committee or Jim, you the chair of the committee, come to Black and White Cabs and look over our operation at any time. So open our doors to you and see what happens in that.
We've discussed that point as a committee, and we have to make a decision because if we go to one, we're going to have to go to the lot.
Yeah, I got you.
And to be fair, so but we want to talk to people. May want to have to talk to people in other communities as well.
Blue and white.
Blue and white.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Just so you can stretch your legs, so don't go too far away because I like to keep the time. We'll be just taking a 10-minute break and resuming again at 10:50.
Well, welcome back. Sorry. Okay, just to catch up where I'm at. First of all, I need to apologise to my colleagues with regard to starting 10 minutes early. They were actually on time. We were early. And I've noted their concerns.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, we've now got before us the RACQ. Welcome representatives from the RACQ, and for the record, could you please state your name and position?
Paul Turner, Executive General Manager Advocacy at RACQ.
Michael Roth, Executive Manager Public Policy for RACQ.
Paul, opening statement.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I want to thank the committee for inviting RACQ here today. RACQ is the independent advocate for Queensland motorists with 1.2 million members across the state. Our advocacy charter incorporates 3 priorities, which include safety, affordability and sustainable mobility. RACQ recently explored a range of ride-sharing issues in an online survey of 1,009 adults, representative of the Queensland demographic profile. Our policy position is informed by the expressed views from this survey, and we have copies of the survey available for the committee if they wish.
You see, we'd like you to table those if you could.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Table them now. Do you want to?
We have 5 copies.
Fantastic. RACQ is opposed to the legislative amendments contained in the Private Members Bill, the Transport Legislation Taxi Services Amendment Bill 2015, for 2 reasons. Firstly, the RACQ strongly opposes the proposed imposition of demerit points on drivers convicted of ride-sharing in Queensland. The RACQ believes demerit points have been introduced for one reason only, to penalise drivers who undertake dangerous acts on our roads. They are to combat the senseless death of more than 200 Queenslanders a year and the serious injury of hundreds more. The purpose of Queensland's demerit point system is to make roads safer by encouraging motorists to drive responsibly. The current list of demerit offences is included in Schedule 3 of the Transport Operations Road Use Management Driver Licensing Regulation 2010. The list only includes road safety related offences. They are not to be used in some clumsy attempt to impose a regulatory outcome where other, more traditional policing measures have failed or are better used elsewhere. In fact, the fundamental premise of the proposed amendments may be flawed. RACQ's understanding is that the Queensland Government and the courts of this state have yet to prove that ride-sharing is an illegal taxi service. We understand that convictions for ride-sharing have...
Order. Let's keep it all under control, guys.
We understand that convictions for ride-sharing have not occurred in Queensland where the charge has been challenged. We also understand the state government is undertaking a review of the legislation pertaining to taxis and ride-sharing. In essence, a road safety management tool such as demerit points should not be used by regulators as a commercial penalty. Secondly, RACQ believes ride-sharing as a disruptive influence in the point-to-point transport system should be considered in a holistic review of the taxi regulations as recently announced by the Queensland Government. RACQ supports the Queensland Government reviewing the Transport Operations Passenger Transport Act 1994 to consider whether ride-sharing and other future transport options can improve the mobility of Queenslanders. In fact, we want the review to conclude faster. When asked whether they felt people should have a choice of taxis or ride-sharing services, RACQ respondents, survey respondents, 80% of respondents agree that they should have a choice, and 80% agree that the government should set rules to ensure ride-sharing is safe. RACQ's position on ride-sharing is consistent with the views of the majority of the Queensland public. RACQ has 3 key objectives of legislative reform on point-to-point transport. These are: Objective 1, the need for regulatory reform. RACQ supports reforms that meet the needs of our members and improve the range of options in point-to-point public transport, including for vulnerable groups such as people with disabilities and the frail-aged. The reforms should allow flexible, innovative and responsive transport models to emerge rather than protecting entrenched business models. Objective 2, safety. Regulatory reform of point-to-point transport services should provide a safety framework that incorporates vehicle safety, driver safety and passenger safety. This would incorporate driver licence and criminal history checks, as well as safe driver training and vehicle inspections for taxis, limousines and ride-share providers. Objective 3, regulatory cost burden. Regulation should support industry reform and improve service delivery. while minimising regulatory and capital cost burdens that would increase the price structure of point-to-point services, including rideshare, taxis and limousines. In particular, the high government and licensing cost burdens on the taxi industry need to be reviewed. Specific licences, compulsory third-party insurance and motor insurance classes for ride-sharing services may also need to be considered. There may be need for transitional arrangements for this to occur. In closing, Mr Chair, I would like to state that ride-sharing is here to stay. It is currently not regulated in Queensland and therefore we are suffering the worst of both worlds. An operating industry used and desired by the community which has insufficient government oversight. Meanwhile, our taxi industry is overburdened with high government-imposed costs and very steep financial barriers to entry. Taxis will always be needed, but we must move quickly to reduce their cost burden and regulate ride-sharing to provide the best outcome for us, the consumer, and our transport system. Every business in the world is now under threat from disruption and competition. Burying our heads in the sand and hoping that it all goes away is not the answer, and it is not what the people of Queensland expect of their elected representatives. Thank you. We're happy to take questions.
Thanks, Paul. I haven't had time to have a look through this, as you would understand, but in putting the questions out there for the public to consider, did you highlight or make those people surveyed aware of the conditions that the taxis operate under versus the conditions that Uber operates under?
I might throw to Michael here, he managed this survey.
I need a good straight answer on this one too.
Yeah, look, the survey questions didn't expect a high level of knowledge on the taxi legislation, but they were objective questions about level of service that the taxi industry provides versus expectations on any future ride-sharing services.
Did you make those people you surveyed aware of the different structures that are operating here? What taxis obviously have got a lot of overheads, operate under a lot of stricter rules. We are able to follow their the money that they take versus something that doesn't have anything anywhere near that.
Consumers are concerned about the safety of the service, not the legislative
hang on, guys. I can ask anybody to leave as a chair if you don't mind. I asked the question, did you make those people you surveyed
We didn't go through the detail of the legislation.
Okay, so I just want to know, I just want to have a good
Mr. Chair,
understanding of the report.
Just for your information, the report was very simple and upfront. It just asked questions about service, about clean cars, that's what it was about. Because what we wanted to know before we got into a policy position around ride sharing is what do our members think about what the service they're getting now, and if they're using ride sharing, what that service means. The regulatory reform and the burdens on the taxi industry are certainly serious questions, but they weren't the purpose of that survey.
Yeah, well, but you're using those.
We're using it to give you an insight into consumer views about the industry and about the service propositions that industry provides, not to the regulatory
surveys. Surveys, mate. I've been around for a while. And
sure.
You'll get the answers that you put the question.
I'm happy to say that. I'm happy to say that we've been doing this for about 100-odd years, Mr. Chair, and we are very careful about how we service and how we survey our members, and we take very seriously the survey credentials when we do it.
And we are also happy to provide the detail of the survey instrument that we used, should you have any concerns on our objectivity or otherwise.
Okay, we'd be happy to have that if you can make that available to us. Michael.
Yes, gentlemen, as a company with an insurance arm, can I ask you where somebody who insures through you would stand if they were providing a rideshare facility and they had a major accident? What sort of coverage would they have?
Thank you. Through you, Chair, our position, just to be clear, I'm happy to answer that in a minute, but advocacy, the area that I run, is very separate from the insurance area, so we adopt policy separate from the corporate area. At the moment, that is a grey area. If people say that they are a commercial operator, then they may not be covered.
So did you take that into account when you put this survey out, that possibly your own company may not insure a driver that is...
As I said, Mr Hart, this is the advocacy position. What we asked was the consumer position. We didn't take into account our business operations.
Okay. I understand. What's the RACQ's view on regulation in general?
We think there's definitely a role for regulation because it's got to be about safety and it's about choice. See, we came to this position. It's ironic. We both caught cabs to this meeting. We didn't That's how we got here. We are big supporters of the taxi industry. What we're not supporters of is allowing situations to develop which may put our members at risk, and also pretending that an industry doesn't exist, or using regulation or legislation to protect entrenched industries when it may not be in the best interests of consumers. That's all we worry about, is what's in the best interest of consumers. They're voting with their feet. A percentage of them think ride sharing is a viable option, regardless of the company providing it. So our view was we need to get an informed position on that. We went out to our members, we asked them, we've spoken to the Taxi Council, we've spoken to the ride sharing industry. We've come to the position that the best and safest way forward is for the ride sharing industry to be regulated, and for us to have a really good hard look at the cost and the barrier to entry for the taxi industry, so that it's more it's more flexible and can provide a genuine competition to the ride sharing.
Okay. I understand the difference between advocacy and your insurance arm, but when you finish here, can you go back to your office and talk to the insurance people and just say to them, okay, assuming, for instance, that ride sharing is deregulated in this state and it puts in place, what will be the occurrence of insurance as far as...
I can tell you, Mr. Hart, that if it is deregulated, that the insurance industry will have a product for ride sharing very, very quickly.
So there'll be a higher fee type
Absolutely.
product?
Well, insurance is based on risk. If someone does a lot more hours on the road than a normal driver, they will pay a higher premium. So therefore, what will probably happen across the industry is that there will be a ride-sharing product in each motor insurer, which will take that risk into account.
Sure. The inquiry into the ride-sharing industry doesn't come back till August next year, I think.
That's right.
It would really help the committee if we could get a position from the RACQ as to what would happen if someone had an accident.
Well, I don't think I can answer on behalf of the insurance industry. I just can't, because every insurer...
Can you answer on behalf of the RACQ?
Every insurer will be treated differently, and if they are a commercial operator operating and they're not paying commercial insurance, then they may not be covered.
Could you take it on notice and ask your insurance arm to come back?
Well, that's the answer I can give you. I have asked the insurance arm, and what they've said is if they're a commercial operator, regardless of how they're doing that, and they're not insured as a commercial operator, they may not be covered. But I can't give you a definitive because it absolutely is a case-by-case.
It hasn't happened yet?
I'm unaware of one if it has.
Okay, thank you.
Paul, is RACQ supporting an illegal activity here?
Well, we're not sure. Is it illegal? I'm not sure that we've had a... our issue is, I think that's a great question, because what we're not supporting, we're certainly not supporting any particular company. What we do is we are one of hundreds of clubs around the world. We've seen the ride-sharing industry develop around the world. To pretend it's not going to happen, to pretend that in Queensland somehow we'll be different from the rest of the world when it comes to ride-sharing services is crazy. We need to, as a society, make sure that people are protected and regulated, but also make sure we get the best transport outcome. So I'm unaware of any convictions. Maybe the committee can help me in that, but I'm unaware of any convictions of ride-sharing drivers in Queensland under the current laws.
Paul, just a question. I suppose I understand your advocacy for RACQ, so I do understand that. But I'm just looking from a business point of view. What's RACQ's, or what's your feeling as a person on a person who has a taxi licence worth $500,000 and it being possibly devalued because of the issue we have here at the moment? Where do you stand there?
I don't know. If I was a Kodak shareholder, I'd say what happened about the digital camera. I mean, we've got to look at it two ways here. The taxi industry has been regulated and government has been milking it for decades. So the government has had hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars in fees from the taxi industry for decades. So we believe as part of the regulation, the government needs to be honest about it, go back in, have a look at the industry and understand that there will probably have to be some sort of buyback scheme or compensation scheme for those who have paid a lot of money for a licence. We are seeing in other states this is already happening. I mean, it's not like we're in isolation here. This has already occurred in Canberra. It's occurring in New South Wales and Victoria where they're looking into it. Annual taxi licences, lifetime taxi licences, different ways of managing this system are all being developed and are there easily for all of us to look at. So I don't believe this is an either-or situation. I don't think it's about legality or illegality. The basic fact is we're not talking about heroin traffickers here. We're talking about Ma and Pa Queenslanders driving their car and earning a few extra dollars on the weekend. Now, yes, there may be professional and there will be professional ride sharers. There's no doubt about it. And they need to be appropriately regulated. They need to be driving a good car. They need to be a good person. So that needs to happen. The only way it happens is if government regulates the industry.
I just got a question on your survey. Was the survey done to the general public or just to RACQ members?
The survey was done to be representative of the Queensland general public. So there's information in there. It's gender and regionally representative of the Queensland adult public.
How did you,
not just RACQ members.
Okay.
well, yeah, so how did you make people aware that you were having a survey with regard to this?
Look, it was done through a surveying firm. The details in the survey, I think it's called My Opinion, professional surveying firm, and they were instructed specifically, and the data's in there, to make the survey representative of the Queensland population based on their large panel of survey respondents.
Mr. Chair, we do a lot of surveys of our own members.
Oh, you do?
We
Question.
absolutely decided not to in this case, that we got an external firm and did it with the general populace because we didn't want it to be seen as RACQ researching its own members.
And just a quick one. It says here your key objectives of legislative reform on point-to-point transport. You've got your first point there is reforms that are good for its members, including disabled and frail. But it appears that none of the Uber services actually support that. So
I can't answer for. We're not here. I want to make it really clear because I know how we get painted in this issue. We're not here to represent any particular company. What we do is we look at mobility and we look at transport options. So my understanding is, I could be corrected on this, that the taxi industry is subsidised to provide disabled services. There's no reason a ride sharer couldn't be the same.
Okay. No, excuse me. You have to keep your comments down, if you don't mind, because I can ask you to go home if you want to, but I don't want to do that. Yeah. Well, you get a safe trip. Given that 80% of the survey respondents agreed that they should have a choice of taxis and ride-sharing services, what is your organisation's view on the best way to accommodate both?
We think what needs to happen is twofold. One, we need to look at upping the ante for the ride-sharing industry and ensuring that they meet certain minimum standards around vehicle and driver in particular, while at the same time decreasing the cost burden on the taxi industry so that they can properly compete. We understand that at the moment it's not a fair and level playing field, but we don't see the answer as trying to remove an industry that's going to survive no matter what. I mean, we already understand that ride sharing is here to stay. It's like going back to the hotel industry and saying, sorry about Airbnb, we'll shut it down. It's gone. That ship has sailed. So what we need to do as a responsible society is ensure that we get the best outcome. So we think ride sharing is here to stay and provides a bridge between the private driver and the regulated transport industry, and therefore it should be regulated. The taxi industry has suffered very high cost to entry, very high government costs for a very long time. The government's made a lot of money out of that over the process. We think they should give some of it back and regulate the industry and reduce those costs. There are examples in other states that are being looked at and in Canberra now that we think provide some template for that, and that's what we think the government should be looking at.
The taxi industry, the legislation was not designed to increase the taxi plate price. It was designed to provide safe taxi services. And that's because the passengers are anonymous in the hailing and in the rank service. So the rank and the hail service should always be only limited to taxis. That is not something that rideshare should be allowed to do. But new technology offers a safe way of identifying the passenger as well as the driver through their credit cards and their membership of that app and that service. So that gets around the safety issue that the legislation and regulation was designed to address.
Yeah. I'll just take one more question.
Does the RACQ insurance division, do they provide insurance to ride-sharing service who identify themselves as ride-sharing service provider?
No.
Why not?
Because it's not a regulated industry.
So even though they're identifying as just share ride service, you won't insure them?
We will insure them for private travel.
So you won't add an extra cost because of the time that
As I
it's been on
said
there?
earlier, I think the industry is very keen to move towards a product that will provide cover and higher premiums probably, because they'll be doing more driving for motorists in ride-sharing industry. But obviously it's very difficult for a very regulated industry like insurance or banking to provide those sort of services to an industry that's not currently regulated.
Just a quick question, Paul. If RACQ see this as ride-sharing, why are Uber concerned about these demerit points?
We believe demerit points are about road safety. That's all we care about. I haven't spoken to Uber about. We have met with Uber, obviously, as we met with yourselves and everyone else. I'm not sure we met on this, actually. I think that was ethanol. Sorry, Shane. But we have met with the Taxi Council and others on this issue. We think demerit points have a very clear role, and that is around road safety. We don't think they should be used for this, and we would oppose it for any other commercial regulation as well. Demerit points are about making our roads safer, not about a commercial outcome or driving ride sharers off the roads.
Thanks, Paul. Time has run out there, I'm sorry, but if we need to come back to it, we will.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Thank you, Committee.
Thank you.
Thank you. I now call Uber to the table, and while that's happening, ladies and gentlemen, I must ask you to refrain from getting boisterous or getting out of hand. I'm an old country bloke, and if we can't respect the right for people to come here and, are you listening there, sir? I hope so. We've got to respect the right to be able to front up to these hearings and be able to present their evidence without fear of being harassed by people in the background. So, if you want to step outside the line, well, I'll just end the hearing, and I'll be asking you to leave. Just as simple as that. Okay. For the record, could you please state your name and position, sir?
Thank you, Chair. Brad Kitschke. I'm the Director of Public Policy for Uber.
Do you have an opening statement?
I do. Thanks very much for the committee for giving us the opportunity to appear today and for the opportunity to provide our written submission. We're a technology company. We have an app, a piece of software that connects a rider who has been pre-authorised to access the software with a driver who has undergone background checks and safety checks. We're popular because Queenslanders have experienced what getting a safe, reliable and affordable ride is like at the touch of a button. And they're telling their friends. In only 18 months, more than 300,000 Queenslanders have chosen to use Uber as their preferred way to get around, and over 4,000 Queenslanders have partnered with Uber to earn some additional income. In that time, there has also been a relentless campaign of scaremongering, intimidation and fear from organisations focused more on protecting their patch than focusing on the interests of consumers or improving their own service levels. However, it's clearly not working because people are voting with their feet. We have 100 staff in Australia, and about 20 of those are based in Queensland, so we're also growing Queensland jobs. Ride sharing is not a taxi service, and it is different than taxis and hire car service, and I'll explain why. There's no anonymity on the Uber platform, unlike when someone gets in a taxi. All riders on the Uber platform are pre-registered and known to Uber. The service is not available to the broader public who are not registered onto the platform, unless obviously they're travelling with someone who is on the platform. All drivers on the Uber platform are registered, and in Queensland, 100% of those drivers have a driver authorisation from the Department of Transport and Main Roads. This means that the Queensland Government has done the criminal history background check, the driver history check, and also signed off on the medical check for 100% of Uber drivers. When a driver accepts a request for a trip, their details, including the photograph, name, make and model and registration of the vehicle, are shared with the rider so they can see the vehicle approaching their location. Ride-sharing drivers do not pick up street rank or hail, and this makes up, the street rank and hail market makes up about 70% of the total point-to-point transport market. There's no cash exchanging hands in a ride-sharing trip, and you can't advance book for ride-sharing. So we only use credit cards. You can't ring up and say, I'd like a ride-sharing vehicle at 8 o'clock on a Saturday night. It's only on demand and ready to ride. It's a new model of transport which is not defined by the existing regulations, and the definitions in the current regulations and legislation do not expressly capture ride sharing. The argument that ride sharing should simply be regulated exactly the same way as a taxi because they both transport people has already been recognised by governments that different forms of point-to-point transport, like taxis and chauffeured hire cars, are regulated in different ways. They both transport people, but they have different models, they have different risks and different mitigation of those risks, and they're regulated in different ways. Ride-sharing only operates in a very discrete part of the point-to-point market. As I mentioned before, more than 70% of the work of the point-to-point market, the work of a taxi, is rank and hail work. This is work that is not available to ride-sharing and is only available to taxis. Taxis also operate in the advanced pre-booked market, which they also shared with chauffeur hire cars. Again, this is not available to ride-sharing. And in the markets, for example, such as the ACT, that's been enshrined in the regulations. To approach the debate with the notion that all parts of a market have access to an equal playing field is fundamentally wrong. The government's already recognised that different models with different access to different parts of the market and different risks get regulated in different ways. And this is why, as I said, they've regulated chauffeur hire cars and taxis in different ways. Data from the Australian Taxi Industry Association and Cab Charge actually indicates that the number of people taking trips in taxis in Australia and in Queensland has increased, despite ride-sharing being around for 18 months. This would indicate that ride-sharing trips are new trips, and that ride-sharing isn't simply capturing an existing market, it's actually growing the total size of the market. To simply conflate ride-sharing with a taxi service is a poor approach to public policy, and it is inaccurate. It's also inaccurate to say that the entrance of ride-sharing into the point-to-point market will mean the replacement of taxis. We believe, as has indicated in many markets overseas, that ride-sharing and taxis can operate side by side. We are just another part of the suite of transport options. Ride-sharing services areas of the market that traditional taxi services do not. It provides wealth creation opportunities for the unemployed and the underemployed, and it allows people to access a different kind of service. It's been made clear through quite a bit of scaremongering and even a question from the committee today that Uber doesn't have a product for those people with different accessibility needs. That's just fundamentally wrong and an absolute falsehood. I'd like to be clear that no Australian court has found ride-sharing to be unlawful. The one case that was taken to court by the Department of Transport and Main Roads in Queensland was dismissed by the magistrate. These are not matters for courts anyway. They're matters for the government to make policy decisions, and the government has instituted a review. We believe that in relation to the specifics of this bill, it's pretty clear from the public commentary that it's being used as a weapon against ride-sharing, even though it's not specific to that in the legislative language. It has been from the public commentary. We're quite concerned that the bill was drafted without any consultation. We never met with Mr Katter. We made 5 requests to meet with Mr Katter. Mr Katter telephoned me for 15 minutes the day before the bill was introduced, and we were quite concerned that someone would actually seek to introduce a piece of legislation and not bother to perhaps consult with the whole range of industry participants. It's pretty clear that the Taxi Council was consulted heavily, however we were not consulted. In our view, this bill is simply about punishing Queenslanders who provide a service that is welcomed by other Queenslanders. And it is intended just to simply protect the turf of an incumbent monopoly. As Choice, the consumer organisation, rightly said in its recent report, the point of regulating should be to protect consumers and encourage competition in the market, not to protect one particular business from its competitors. We submit that this bill does not meet the foundational principle of legislation.
Thank you very much. Earlier in your statement, you talked about 300,000. That was 300,000 Queenslanders choose to use Uber. How do you get to these people to take an interest in the service that you're providing?
Most of the people that sign up for our service are simply by word of mouth. We don't do a lot of traditional advertising. People have found out about the service through their friends. They've tried it with their friends. and the feedback to us is that they found it to be superior to services that they've used before, and they do it. We don't really do a lot of aggressive marketing in that particular respect.
So how do they get to join that list
Certainly.
of people?
So you download the app. You then have to provide certain amounts of information into the app, credit card details. You need to provide, obviously, information about who you are. So there is a pre-verification process, obviously, for the rider. And then similarly, there's the pre-verification process for the driver. So for a driver who wants to drive, they would come into our office. They would talk to us. They would then go to the Department of Transport and Main Roads. The Department of Transport and Main Roads would give them the driver authority and do the criminal history background check, driver history check, and sign off on the medical. And then the person would go and ensure that their vehicle has a third-party vehicle inspection. So we have an organisation that conducts third-party vehicle inspections once every 12 months. That's a requirement on our platform. And the person does that. If all of those things come through, then we allow the person to become a driver and partner with us on the platform.
Thank you. Point to point, what's your definition of point to point?
My definition of a point to point, going from one point to another.
For sure. But when a person's travelling from one point to another, how do you get your people, these 300,000, how do you get any individual from that 300,000 to be aware that you're standing nearby to act as a pickup and take home?
So when you request a ride on the app, you put in the address where you're at. You can also press a button to say drop the pin, which will provide the GPS location. The driver that is in the nearest line of sight, closest, is sent a message on their app to say there is someone at this address. For example, Parliamentary Annex. There's someone at the Parliamentary Annex who, and by the way, it's a very popular pickup spot. The Parliamentary Annex, someone wants to be picked up there. The driver has 15 seconds to press a button to accept that ride, and then they go and pick them up. The rider then is advised by the app. For example, Jim is your driver. There's a picture of Jim. There's Jim's vehicle number plate and also the type of car that you're in, so you can identify. When the driver turns up, you obviously would ask the rider, are you Brad? Yes. Jump in the car. At the end of the trip, the driver presses a button, then the rider's credit card is debited, and they're emailed a receipt pretty much immediately.
Yeah. Do you offer incentives to people to join your?
There are a range of incentives for people to join. Sometimes it's if people who are an existing driver want another person, a friend, to sign up, we'll offer an incentive. We also offer incentives in terms of guaranteed hourly earnings. So on the Uber app, people only do it part-time, so it's not a full-time gig. The average person would work and drive around about 20 hours a week, and for 20 hours a week, they're getting about $30 an hour.
Yeah. Do you offer incentives to the public to come and join Uber?
Sometimes, so for example, we would do a give-get code where it says, if I'm a rider and I can get a code that I'll give to a friend, and they'll get the first $10 off their first ride.
I've been told as much as $45. Is that any
It depends on the individual promotion.
Who's the driver or
Sorry?
the company?
The company is offering an incentive, not the driver.
Okay. Well, how does that become individual?
Sorry?
How does that become individual?
I said individual promotion is in running a promotion over this month or,
Okay.
Brad, I'm not sure how long you've been here today, but there's been some issues that have been brought up, and I'd like you to respond to some of those. So
sure.
You said before that the difference with ride sharing, and I won't talk about Uber, just ride sharing versus taxi industry, is you don't have any hail or rank pickups.
Or advanced booking.
Can you tell me what the difference is between those and Uber zones?
So an Uber zone is something that's been set up in where we have large festivals, and it's essentially a place that somebody can go to when there's a large event, knowing that their pre-requested rider can go there to essentially meet them. So it's not a rank. A rank works in you line up. This is not where cars are banking up waiting for someone. This is just a place where the driver knows that they can drive in. So I would call, for example, the car park of the Parliamentary Annex is essentially a zone. because if I book a ride, the driver knows they can come into that spot, I can jump in and they go. It's fundamentally different from a rank because there is no lining up, there is no waiting, there is no sitting waiting for the next fare. It's already requested. They could be 5 or 10 minutes away. It's just that they know that that spot is there for them to pick the person up.
Wouldn't drivers tend to culminate around those areas, though?
Generally, no, because they're pretty busy and our average pickup time is less than 4.5 minutes. So they're getting a fair bit of work. They don't need to sit and wait.
So the RACQ in their discussion with us said that they weren't sure whether somebody who has an accident who is covered by RACQ may in fact be covered if they are providing a ride share. What's your comments on that, and what does your company do about that?
Sure. So the first thing I think I need to make with respect to insurance is that there have been what essentially have just been fundamental lies perpetrated by the Taxi Council of Queensland and its supporters with respect to insurance. Every Uber partner is required to have insurance, so third-party property or comprehensive, and we check that when the person signs up to the platform. If that person's individual insurance, for whatever reason, doesn't cover something when it happens, then we have a $20 million third-party bodily injury and property damage policy, which is issued by an Australian insurer, CGU, which covers every ride-sharing trip. So it's fundamentally wrong to say that a person can get into a ride-sharing vehicle as a passenger and there be an accident and an Australian insurer doesn't cover them. That is what has been perpetrated by the TCQ, and I'm here to tell you today it's a fundamental lie.
So you've got a $20 million policy that
Yes.
covers every Uber driver in Australia.
Every Uber trip.
Every Uber trip. So I imagine if someone has a serious accident, that policy will get eaten up very quickly. Won't
But
it?
we have more than 15,000 drivers on the road in Australia every day. Just like the taxi industry, incidents happen. I've not seen one report of anything happening or one report of a ride-sharing passenger where something has happened and they've said they've not been covered.
Can you give us any confidential information about what claims have been made?
I'll talk to our insurance arm if you like, and I can get some further information on the detail of insurance. I mean, you would be aware, for example, that the ACT has regulated ride sharing, and so we've had to have conversations with the CTP insurers, the CTP regulator, and make them comfortable with the way in which our insurance arrangements operate. In the ACT, the CTP providers are the commercial insurance providers, so NRMA, Suncorp, NRMA and a couple of others, and they are comfortable with the arrangements and those arrangements are the same as the arrangements in Queensland.
Okay, can you tell me, does that policy cover the other person that's involved in the accident and
the passenger
and the car that is involved?
No, the person's individual insurance covers the car.
So my understanding would be that if you're operating an illegal service or haven't declared to your insurance company that you are running that service, that you probably wouldn't be covered, your car.
So I think insurers have wrestled with the question of what's the difference between a real estate agent who picks up somebody who's their client and drives them around on a Saturday, showing them 5 houses, to someone who drives for 3 hours during the week, doing ride sharing. There's no difference, and that's why the ACT CTP regulator has agreed that ride-sharing vehicles will be recognised under the CTP scheme as Class 1, which is private use, because there is an amount of private use that is allowed, commercial use there's an amount of non-private use allowed in those policies, and it is no different. If I went out and did ride-sharing for 5 hours a week, my normal insurance policy would probably cover it.
Yeah, it seems like a very grey area to me. One last question.
I think the RACQ made the best point, which is because of the fact that this is an emerging industry, I think that the insurance industry will catch up and just have a specific product where someone can ring up and say, you know, I've got my normal RACQ policy, but I do 5 hours a week ride sharing, so can you add on the ride sharing addition, and it'll probably be a small additional fee, and that's how it'll be covered.
Okay, just be careful about this question, okay? I want to talk about GST, but if there's a court case going on, tell us now and we won't talk about it. So
I can answer questions about the goods and services tax that won't prejudice the matters that are before the court.
Right. Is that okay? Yeah. So We heard before that the ATO had ruled that your drivers should be paying GST and that maybe you're not. Can you clarify that for us?
So in Australia, any individual or small business doesn't have to register and get an ABN and do quarterly BAS statements unless their turnover, their revenue, is greater than $75,000. So your local lawn mowing person, if they're running a small business and they don't earn $75,000 a year, they are not required to register for GST. They're not required to get a BAS and do get ABN and do the quarterly business statements. So ride sharing, we don't believe is a taxi service. We believe ride sharing is not a taxi service, and it should be treated no differently, for example, than someone who puts their house on Airbnb. If they've got a spare room or a holiday house, they can put that onto Airbnb. They can earn $74,999 a year and not get an ABN and not do quarterly business BAS statements. So our drivers are responsible individually for their own tax affairs. If they reach that threshold, like any other small business operator, they have to register and then they have to remit and undertake all of the appropriate requirements.
Just my question in regards to the taxation side to it. Can you confirm that a Uber passenger has a contract with Uber BV, which is in the Netherlands-based company, and the fare for the ride is paid directly to Uber BV by the way of debiting the passenger's registered credit card? If this is the case, what income tax company's tax does Uber pay?
So we covered all of these answers in the Senate inquiry, so I'll refer you to the transcript of the Senate inquiry and perhaps ask if I can answer questions about the bill that your committee is supposed to be looking into.
Well,
the answer to the question is that Uber pays corporate taxation in Australia. It's on the public record. We covered it at a recent Senate inquiry. I can send you the transcript. If you're looking for me to repeat answers so that you can go outside and do a media conference, I'm not going to do it.
Well, that's fine, but it's not very transparent in front of the committee.
I'm extremely transparent. I will provide the chair of the committee and the member and the researcher of the committee a copy of the Hansard transcript, which has all of the answers into it.
Order. We'll make sure we get that, and we don't run outside and do media conferences.
Oh, I don't think you would.
No, well, we don't.
Yes. Yeah, my next question is that Uber make much of not being a taxi service but being a ride-sharing service. If Uber is not a taxi service, why is Uber concerned about the demerit points within this bill?
Because your colleague has said that this bill is deliberately targeted against our company. And and yourself have made those claims publicly. So that's why we're concerned.
But shouldn't you be not concerned if you're not a...
we don't believe we are a taxi.
You're not a taxi, so there's nothing to worry about. So this bill should go ahead with the...
Well, no, I don't believe the bill should go ahead, and I think the RACQ probably made some of the best arguments as to why it shouldn't, because it really is a perversion of what was supposed to be about safety.
Well, you shouldn't have anything to worry about, is that right? Because if it's not a...
I don't believe
if
so.
If it's not a taxi...
That's right.
Yeah, so you've got nothing to worry about.
Well, and if that was the case, I believe that the DTMR would have made a successful prosecution by now, which they haven't done in 18 months.
Okay, Shane, I want a couple of questions up here.
I just want to ask a few questions on the service itself. Can you tell me if I catch a Uber vehicle to a set point every day, will the bill be the same every time I get in that vehicle?
Depends. So it's about charges are on time and distance. So if obviously it takes a little bit longer.
But if it's the same travel, if I travel from the Parliamentary Annex here to the casino every day, will the price be exactly the same every day?
No, because if it takes longer, because there's lots of traffic, the price is charged on time and distance.
Okay.
So obviously the distance is probably the same if you're going exactly the same distance, but if you're stuck in traffic and it takes a bit longer. What you can do on the app, though, before you request a fare, is you can do a fare estimate and say, I'm going from here to here. And it'll provide you with, maybe say it's going to be $15 to $21. Mm-hmm. What will happen is if it is more than that, you can contact our customer service area. They'll have a look at your trip. They'll have a look at the route that the driver took. And if they did take a different way, then you can be provided with a refund. It's all extremely transparent.
Right, so that's the travel to and from. What about if there's not enough drivers on the road? Is there such a thing as Uber price surging?
Yeah, so we do have dynamic pricing. It's a fundamental principle of economics, which is that you provide an opportunity for people to charge more and incentivise to more cars to get on the road. So the drivers will see, essentially on the driver app, they'll see a heat map. So the city is divided up into zones, and they'll see so the whole system is designed to avoid the application of dynamic pricing, because we want people to be able to get a ride whenever they need one. But if something happens, if all of a sudden we didn't know that a footy game was finishing, and it does, and then there's a huge surge of demand in one area, and there's so many more requests for rides than there are drivers, then what it allows us to do is increase the price. We advise the rest of the driver pool that the price is increasing in that area. It incentivises those people to go there and pick people up. And then the riders are getting a lift when they normally wouldn't have got one. Now, people can choose not to do that. They can choose to wait. When you have dynamic pricing, you have to confirm that you're happy to pay that extra. And you can also do a fair estimate based on the increased amount. So there's a couple of steps process to ensure that there's a large amount of consumer transparency.
So there's been some reports, and are you aware, sorry Jim, just a quick one, that what the Uber drivers are doing is switching off their phones, so it appears that there's less drivers on the road so they can charge more when they fire their phone back up. Does that happen?
I think that our systems are far more sophisticated to allow that to work.
So you're saying it doesn't happen?
To my knowledge, no. I mean, there are lots of reports of lots of misinformation, but our system is designed to get people from A to B when they need to, in a fair and reasonable way.
I want the member for Keppel to have a question.
Yes, Brad. Is Uber actively blocking compliance investigations by the Department of Transport and Main Roads in Queensland?
Sorry, in what way?
Anyway.
So I think you need to be more specific on that.
Are you blocking compliance investigations by the department?
Are you tracking phone,
So there have been some incidences of people using the platform outside of the terms of service, and when someone uses the platform outside of the terms of service, they're not allowed to use the platform anymore.
So your terms of service prevent Main Roads...
That's not what I said.
I'm asking a question. So the Department of Transport and Main Roads is prevented from undertaking compliance investigations under Queensland law because your terms of service prevent it.
That's not what I said.
You said that your terms
What I
of
said
service
was if
prevent-
somebody uses the app outside of terms of service, then they're removed from being able to use the app.
So you're
I don't know of the specific circumstance or the specific information to which you're referring to, so I can't answer more specifically.
It's an interesting response. I just have one more, please, Chair. From what you've described today, Uber, you can order a car, it picks you up from one point and drops you off to another in a vehicle. The customer pays by a credit card. The charges are based on time and distance. There's a pool of drivers available, and those drivers are remunerated for their work. What is it? I haven't heard anything apart from the RACQ and hail system that differs Uber between a taxi.
Or a hire car, if you're going to use that analogy. And that's where I think there's a fundamental flaw. There's a conflation of these issues that says, well, ride-sharing does a little bit of this, so therefore it's the same as taxis. Well, hire car, a chauffeur-driven hire car has a pool of drivers. It charges a fare. It picks someone up from somewhere to where they want to go. Why aren't they regulated like a taxi then? Why haven't you as a legislator said, well, that's exactly the same as a taxi. Regulate a chauffeured hire car exactly the same as a taxi. And the reason is because they have different access to different markets with a different model, and they do things in a different way. And so regulators have said taxis can be regulated like this because they do this kind of work, because they have access to this kind of the market. Chauffeured hire cars can be regulated in this way. Ride sharing is different. It doesn't do street rank and hail. It has a different model. It mitigates risks in a different way. And so it needs a regulatory approach. I'm not denying that it needs a regulatory approach, but it's a fundamental conflation to continue just to say and to not recognise that the Parliament has already regulated different forms of point-to-point transport that compete with each other in a different way.
Unfortunately, we have run out of time. Thank you for your attendance today, and I'd ask that the audience just behave yourselves when this gentleman attempts to leave the room.
Thanks, Chair. Just in relation to the additional information, if someone's able to email me the specifics of what you're after, try and get the information back to you, if not today, tomorrow.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay, now call on Mr. Cutter. I'm sorry, no, it's the department first. Sorry about that, Rod. When I saw you get up, I thought you were a bit keen.
He's fired up, he's ready.
Yeah. Okay, could you please give your names and positions? Thank you.
Peter Millwood, Acting Deputy Director General, Translink Division, TMR.
And John Robluski, Acting General Manager, Transport Regulation Branch, TMR.
Thanks, John. You got an opening statement?
Yes, I do.
Thank you.
Thank you. Firstly, thank you for giving myself and my other Department of Transport and Main Roads colleague the opportunity to speak to you today about the Taxi Legislation Amendment Bill. Before taking your questions and discussing the Department's view on the amendments, I would like to make a short opening statement, which I hope will provide some context to how the Department has come to its view. By way of background, the Transport Operations Passenger Transport Act 1994 and its subordinate legislation regulates vehicles licensed as taxis, people authorised to drive taxis, and operators accredited to provide taxi services. The intent of the Act is to provide the travelling public with a level of confidence in the taxi industry, safe in the knowledge that service providers and their vehicles are appropriately assessed, regulated and monitored. In addition to this, the Act is also designed to promote passenger safety, driver safety, public convenience and accessibility. Examples of some of the visible benefits this regulation provides include the requirement for taxis to have security camera systems fitted, which provides peace of mind when customers enter a taxi service. The taxi subsidy scheme, which is designed to assist with improving the mobility and quality of life of residents with a disability. The minimum service levels applied to taxi booking services to ensure customers can get home and get home safely. And the extensive vehicle requirements which certify that vehicles are subject to ongoing inspections and age limit requirements which ensure that vehicles are safe. That being said, the passenger transport legislation was written some 20 years ago and did not foresee the emergence of software apps which facilitate unauthorised taxi services. As a result, for a range of reasons, services provided by entities such as Lyft and Uber, as well as other emerging smart phone platforms, are not contemplated or authorised by the legislation. Although these reasons vary depending on the entity, the main issues of contention include they provide a taxi service without a taxi service licence, and drivers of these services operate without the appropriate driver authorisation. I acknowledge that because of this, the wider taxi industry is frustrated and that these types of unauthorised passenger transport services are currently operating contrary to the Act. In response, the Department is well aware of these frustrations and we are taking a number of actions to address these concerns. Before briefly outlining these actions, though, I would like to highlight that the Deputy Premier has recently announced an independent task force to review personalised transport services across Queensland. The review will investigate opportunities to uphold safety standards, meet customer needs and increase competition. The review must also identify what a potential future market state could look like. This may include, but is not limited to, an appropriate long-term flexible regulatory framework focused on service outcomes, where costs do not exceed the public benefits, which is also innovative and accommodates future progression. Addressing the needs of the community across Queensland, including those with disabilities or reduced mobility. The safety of the community and drivers, and appropriate compliance strategies and enforcement measures which can adapt in line with industry progression. To achieve this, The task force will be supported by a review secretariat who will report to the chair of the task force. As per the task force's terms of reference, the task force will be responsible for engaging and consulting with stakeholders and the wider community to ensure views are appropriately considered. Additionally, the task force is required to develop a shared set of guiding principles to shape the reform options and recommendations for government consideration, develop a consultation paper to support public discussion on reform options, report on progress to the Deputy Premier, and develop a final report that presents recommendations and reform options and details the preferred option for Queensland Government consideration. The task force is strictly independent of the department, and you're here to understand what the department's view is on the Taxi Legislation Amendment Bill. Therefore, to elaborate further on this, I would like to hand over to John Wroblewski from the department's Customer Services Safety and Regulation branch, and then following this we are happy to take some further questions.
Thank you.
Thanks, Peter. TMR is continually evaluating enforcement techniques for effectiveness and is investigating new methods and enforcement strategies. Department compliance officers have dedicated over 14,700 hours to the interception of vehicles and collation of evidence associated with illegal taxi services. These compliance activities are essential for two key reasons. Firstly, they are crucial in ensuring that the provisions of the Act are adhered to. Those who choose not to adhere to the Act are dealt with via the enforcement mechanisms available to the Department through the Act. Secondly, by having boots on the ground and officers visible on the street carrying out these activities, compliance officers act as a deterrent to companies who operate unauthorised passenger transport services, as well as their drivers. The visual presence of these officers ensures that all parties are aware that the services they are providing are not authorised and by extension discouraged from providing those services. That being said, there has been increased challenges in identifying Uber drivers, noting the avoidance strategies by Uber and its drivers already on record. Transport inspectors also need to have sufficient evidence to ensure that a penalty infringement notice in any particular circumstances can be issued. In response, the Department is reviewing its compliance strategy within the constraints of the current passenger transport legislation. Understandably, the Department is reluctant to share specifics of those ongoing operational compliance strategies. In general, though, compliance activity has been ongoing and further compliance activity is planned over the next few months. A range of options have also been considered with regard to better supporting transport inspectors during their on-road compliance effort, as well as options to enhance the existing legislation and to ensure it's contemporary while maintaining the intent of the law that was originally drafted. It is important to note that within the context of the taxi review, which is looking at an appropriate long-term regulatory framework and compliance strategies. With respect to the content of the bill we are speaking on, the Department believes further consideration needs to be given to the bill in its current form. There are two main reasons for this. While demerit points are typically linked to offences with a road safety risk like speeding, mobile phone use or failing to stop at red traffic lights, the Committee needs to consider the use of demerit points in the context of intent and operation of the legislation. This is to ensure that appropriate safety behaviours are achieved and drivers comply with driver authorisation requirements. The Committee would also need to consider whether the allocation of demerit points to an offence with a primary regulatory or economic outcome is appropriate. Double demerit points are only currently applied to very high-risk driving behaviours where other harder sanctions are not available. Double demerit points currently apply to failure to wear an approved motorcycle helmet, speeding in excess of 20 kilometres per hour of the posted speed limit, fail to wear a seatbelt and using any function of a mobile phone that is held in the driver's hand. Applying double demerit points for an offence without a clear road safety link would be a significant shift. The bill also does not adequately address the issues experienced in the compliance and enforcement of unauthorised services. The allocation of demerit points in isolation of other supporting measures will not be enough to adequately deal with avoidance strategies such as those that you have been using and the application of current legislation, including corresponding offences, which was written some 20 years ago. Any consideration about the allocation of demerit points would be enhanced by also considering these key factors. We're happy to take any further questions.
Thank you. A member of the public jumps into a vehicle, is moved from point to point A to point B. Can you tell me when does that, the movement of a vehicle and carrying a passenger become a taxi service? what makes it a taxi service? What's the meaning of taxi service?
There's a piece of work that we've done which explains the legislation, how it's implied, the elements we'd have to prove to determine whether a person was providing a taxi service and then whether they had the correct authority. There are lots of elements to the proof of that. I can't provide that with you at the moment because it's just too complicated for me to repeat, but I'm happy to make it available to the committee.
Thank you very much. Have you applied any of those to the current situation?
The team are using that layout to work through the current pending charges.
Okay. Michael? 1,536 PINs have been issued since July 2014. How many in the last month?
I don't have the figure for the last month. Sorry, again, I'm happy to make that available.
Is it zero or above zero?
I'm sorry, I don't actually have the number, sorry.
Okay.
We'd have to take that on notice.
Can you take that on notice again?
Certainly.
Yes.
Now, I understand that you don't want to talk publicly about what sort of action you may be taking.
Yes.
But are you happy to talk to the committee privately about those issues?
Yes.
Okay.
I think the other consideration there, through the chair, is that through the review processes there will be consideration around some of the regulatory options. So
sure.
It'll be a fulsome consideration.
Are you aware?
Process.
Are you aware of the amendments that the Taxi Council has put forward with regard to giving police powers to pull over people that are deemed to be breaking the law, or making sure that those laws are referenced in the Police Powers Act?
I haven't specifically seen that reference. We have talked about the existing powers capable to compliance inspectors inside our own work. Again, I'd rather not talk about available powers because it relates to strategies and tactics and how we undertake work in a public hearing.
Yeah, that's good. Thanks.
Right.
Just you mentioned there before, and I believe this is what you were saying, that Uber provide a taxi service without a taxi licence. Is that correct?
They're currently deemed as, under the Act, they're an unauthorised service. Our focus is on passenger safety. Our view is that people should be using those services that are authorised by the legislation, such as taxis, for those primary safety considerations.
Okay. So basically you consider it as they provide a taxi service without a taxi licence. Under the Act, does the department interpret this as breaking the law?
We believe the service is unlawful.
Yep.
We believe it's an unauthorised service.
Okay, thanks. Brittany, last question.
Has a complaint been made at all on behalf of the government to Apple if the app is in breach of if you say it's unlawful in the state of Queensland and the Apple guidelines require that apps must obey by the law in which in the state in which they're offered?
I think we'd have to take that on notice because there's implications around the Telecommunications Act too and some of the ramifications that we might need to consider there. So if I could, I'd take that on notice. Thanks.
All right. I've just had it pointed out to me that there is one question which we feel as though we must ask as part of this today's hearing. Can you please give us some information about the cease and desist order provided to Uber in May 2014? What is the process following a failure to comply with a cease and desist order?
I don't have any further information on the cease and desist order. We'd have to take that on notice and provide that back to you.
Okay.
But I think there's been a level of compliance activity which we've referred to in terms of the number of hours that have been put into compliance activity.
Okay, thanks very much. Could we have those documents you promised us by the 7th?
7th December, yes.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Righto, Robbie. I'll get it right this time.
Got it all wrong.
Good point.
By the way, Mr. Chair.
You are certainly right, Mr. Catter. Just give your name and position, mate.
Rob Catter, member for Mount Isa.
Thank you. You have an opening statement?
Yeah, I do. I'm surprised that I'm still surprised what we've heard here today, but we've had a multinational business that's come in here, doing what they should do, trying to make a profit, promoting their interests with some silky smooth words, and it's the tail wagging the dog. They've come in. If I'm going to bring a new business into this state, I check that I conform with the regulations. I check with the government, see if I'm right to go. If I'm not, I'd lobby my local member. I'd try and get the rules and regulations changed to accommodate my business. Then I'm off and away. I find it terribly offensive that we have a business here that's completely disregarded the fact, even if it hasn't gone to a court of law, it hasn't been tested in a court of law, but I'm confident that if it was, we'd find that it would confirm what we just heard from DTMR. It is unlawful, and we're sitting around twiddling our thumbs watching them break the law while they push their business and putting thousands of businesses at risk. I question what is our job here as government. What is the point of us being here? Because we've set regulatory framework for better or for worse, and like I said at the start, there's two parts to this bill. One is acknowledging that it's an unlawful activity and addressing that and policing that. The other is the philosophical debate whether they should be allowed or not. But park that aside for the moment. We've all seen that they're unlawful, and their only response to that we've heard from Uber today was, oh, it hasn't been tested in the court of law. I'd suggest that's because they're a big multinational corporate with deep pockets that are scaring everyone, and they're scaring politicians because they're trying to win over the public debate. Now, I'd like to take to issue one of the points that was made by RACQ, which was a highly narrow view, and you narrowed in very well, Mr. Chairman, in an objective manner, saying what was the point of your questionnaire. You can fill out you can ask someone objectively. I can go survey all the kids in Brisbane and say, what do you eat for breakfast? They'll say McDonald's. Is that a good outcome if we test on that survey? If you don't educate people on what are the implications, what are we talking about here with this taxi industry? Because in 10 years' time you might wake up and you don't have the same disability service, or they're chasing 90 million in tax revenue that's not there because they're not paying their taxes in Australia. There's all these other inadvertent things that this business of Uber is not talking to you about, and of course they're going to keep that away from when you quite rightly zeroed in on them and tried to press on these inadvertent things that are happening around their industry. Well, that's such a narrow view, and quite frankly, it's a lack of leadership. You don't go to the public, and I think there's a good word to use as relativism. We don't keep slipping to the lowest common denominator. One of the strong arguments there used by Uber was that hotel B&Bs are here to stay. Why? No one said that legally, if this is not tested, if we accept that this is a legal activity and we don't want it here, well, we should make that decision. The voters and the politicians should make the decision, not a market-based decision that's influenced by giving out ice creams and $45 subsidised rides and winning public opinion that way. It's undemocratic. It's not the way we're set up. And if we're going to act like that and just say, well, it's here to stay, as the RACQ said, as Uber said, well, why are we wasting our time with these things? We make a law, and for better or for worse, they're there. And until that review comes in and we determine where that law should be there or changed, they should respect the laws that we make in this place. And even if there's doubt, they're saying, well, it hasn't been tested in court of law, but it's highly likely it is unlawful. Well, shouldn't the responsible thing to be to say, well, we'll just park our business until we're sure that it is lawful, then we'll start to operate and compete. The other point that they make about they're not competing, it's a different type of business. Well, somewhere along the line, the common sense test has to be applied here. Why are we talking about, and quite frankly, some of the false statements I'm making, 70% hail and ride, well, it's 50% is the measured one we can confidently say. So they're the ones throwing around, these false figures at the moment. But there is a drop in the taxi market. That's why we're seeing so much attention here, and it's mimicking what the taxi service do, and that's the whole point. And I mean, usually the law and policy makers have to see through the silky smooth words and all these highly sophisticated arguments that make it sound really technical and realise it's the same service. They're mimicking the service that someone's make money, and we've built regulations around that. And I pulled out one of the comments they made in their submission that said that the public commentary by DTMR and the government has been speculative and it's evidence of gross protectionism. Well, where does that stop, gross protectionism? Hotel industries, we put regulations in there, and people will spend $1 million on buying a pub because they know that business is protected by the laws that enshrine that industry. And we've done that because we're confident that the government will enforce those laws and police that. And, it's been said before, but for the same reason, we don't want houses up the road starting to sell booze and creating dramas, we have those laws and we police them, and it's exactly the same principle here. And bring up Airbnbs, I think that seems to be one of the foundations for their argument of why they should exist, is that we should just accept these things because they're here. That's a completely flawed, and like I said, it's relativism. It's not, we don't just re-regulate to match the desires and intentions of expanding global business idea that may or may not be good. We haven't determined that yet, whether it's in the best interests of drivers. And, you know, a little survey going out from the RACQ is not saying, well, yeah, that's final, that'll determine our position, because a lot of people said that they think it's a nice idea. I noted with great interest that Uber avoided the questions on price gouging, which had some other clever name, but no one's being made aware in these surveys, or when they're taking advantage of what might be a lower price now out in there, but they're not aware of the fact that they might be facing price gouging or hikes, or cars that aren't available because it's not a 24-hour service, or that their cousin who's disabled may not get a cab because, yes, they do have disabled vehicles, but there's no obligation there. There's a 20-25% obligation on which isn't subsidised, as the RACQ claimed in here. It's not subsidised. Well, they pay for that out of their own profits they're making already. And is that a bad thing? I mean, it's a community service, and that's the whole point of regulation, so that we know we've got enough disabled vehicles there to handle those things. But if we want to let these people have their way, there's no guarantee or control over that. Or if there is, after you do regulate, wait till that happens. Don't let them destroy an industry or start pulling it to pieces before they've even got permission to do it. The point, I think they were very good questions on the TMR, where I find it highly offensive. I've said it before, that a company can come in knowing they're unlawful in their activities and start blocking the phones of TMR officers trying to do their job. I just find that so highly offensive, regardless of the issue. Forget we're talking about Uber. I find it so highly offensive as we sit here as policy makers debating things, putting in policy and then we review policies if we think they need it. There's a review in place. Wait till that happens, and then you can conduct your activities. Until then, they should show the respect to the laws that we have here and not conduct their activity. And I don't think that's a big ask. They said that, did I consult with them before the bill? I'd be very interested to know if Uber consulted with the government or the taxi industry before they moved into Queensland and started bulldozing their way into the market. I think that would be an interesting question to ask. They talk about safety. I think it was interesting that they're saying that demerit points should just be related to safety. Well, that's a really interesting statement to make, because you can get 2 demerit points for failing to display clearly legible P plates, green P plates, failing to display clearly legible L plates, or failing to display clearly legible red P plates. Safety, well, there's no driver fatigue regulations in Uber at the moment. I think it's 16 hours in the taxi industry, but there's regulations there again. And yes, there might be costs from the government, because it does cost to regulate, but we benefit from those costs. That there's a community service component of taxis that we benefit from. So to just say that, we should deregulate the hell out of everything, or in fact, to be kind, you might say regulate a portion to fit what they want to do. Well, you've got to measure that against the disbenefit, or what that's going to do to all the benefits we've got out of a regulated industry, and that wasn't acknowledged in any of those contributions I heard from the RACQ or Uber. There is inadvertent effects to the things that they're doing. It was raised earlier. There's been evidence out there that people are starting to even offer rides services, taxi-type services, unlike not even under the Uber banner, because they can see that the government's not enforcing the laws, and it encourages that sort of behaviour. So that's outside of Uber's control, but it's an inadvertent effect of doing nothing. So all we're saying with this bill is, if you are an unlawful activity, and the member for Dalrymple's question was spot on, if you've got nothing to worry about, and it's not going to cost the government any more money, demerit points, but it's a disincentive for them if they're breaking the law. So how they can be sitting here arguing against it on any other basis, we're not necessarily having a philosophical debate here. We're just saying there is a law. We just heard DTMR saying that it is an unlawful practice, and it needs to be policed. If it's not being policed at the moment because they need more effective tools, let's give them an effective tool with Demerit Points. We do it for other minor things. I think this is a big thing. I find it offensive, and I think this is the least of what we should be doing to intervene here. And what I find just an offensive practice. And you know, if this is called protectionism with small business, well, so be it. But there needs to be some point where we put the national interest test on these things and say, is this better for a few consumers who might be manipulated by popular opinion so something's new and trendy, or do we make responsible decisions as government and show leadership that is in the best long-term interest? And that hasn't been done here. This is a strong commercial push into a market that they've got a strong commercial advantage because they bypass the regulations. They don't have the same level of security. They don't have 24-hour rolling criminal checks like the taxi industry does. They get tested once every 12 months when they go for their licence. So it's nowhere near the same level of security on that basis. And there are safety issues with them. Outside of the driver fatigue, there's taxi ranks are made. We legislate, councils create taxi ranks, and there's all sorts of activities that happen around those to control the flow of traffic. But picture a world where there's 20% of the taxi industry left and the rest is Uber. You've got a whole heap of Uber cars pulling up outside Fridays here, there and everywhere. It's not controlled. So, and that's what we've got at the moment until there's any regulation around that industry. They shouldn't be operating now, and we should be doing more about policing it. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Cutter. My first question was going to be with regard to comments that you may have heard here this morning, but I don't think we need to worry about that one. You've just covered that quite well. Do you have any views about whether it may be better to regulate ride sharing than to provide a further penalty for taxi service offences?
It was a bit slow on the uptake. Can you, Mr. Chair, say that again?
That's okay, mate. Do you have any views about whether it may be better to regulate ride sharing than to provide a further penalty for a taxi service offence?
Well, in the short term, definitely penalties in the short term, on the basis that I think it's offensive. You need to send a signal to any other businesses that come into our state, into our country, into our state in this case, bypass the laws, or say, well, there's a small chance we might be lawful, so let's just keep, let's not wait for permission, let's just keep operating and block their attempts to try and fine us. I think we need to send a signal to, hotel owners, pharmacy owners, people invest in businesses around Queensland that, no, we will uphold the laws that we make, and we'll take a responsible attitude to developments in a market. We'll have a look at it, we'll review it, but until then you cannot operate.
Michael.
Robbie, just pulling you back to the actual bill, because we're not going to get a result from the review till August next year, so things may change then. In the meanwhile, the department's already told us this is an unlawful ride-sharing business or taxi service. So we need to look at whether your proposals are the best way to deal with that being illegal, and maybe what sort of amendments we could make to it. Now, the Taxi Council has recommended that we look at some amendments to make sure that the Transport Operations Act is inserted into the Police Powers and Responsibilities Act, so the police will have authority to pull over people that they deem to be breaking the law. What are your thoughts on that?
Oh, good question. That adds to the integrity of the bill, that picks up on what we're trying to achieve here, which is to clamp down on people that unlawfully practice, in this business. So if the whole point is we're trying to send a signal that if you're unlawful, we're going to come down and there'll be a result, and if a consequence is the word I'm after. Thanks. So I think that adds to the bill, and fully supportive of that.
Okay.
I was going to ask the same question.
Yeah. Glenn.
I understand, and I think you answered this a little bit before, I understand that you work with the industry stakeholders while preparing the bill. What, if any, consultation? I remember the guy said that you did give him a call, prior to the bill being introduced.
Yeah.
What consultation did you undertake with Uber and any other ride-sharing services prior to your introduction of this bill?
All right, so I took it Uber ride and I read their submission. I think it was to the Senate, their document, and which gave recommendations to how the law should work in Queensland. I read that, and subsequently read their submission and had that discussion, and nothing new came out of that discussion. There's what Uber don't acknowledge is that there's a lot of peripheral issues to just their business. They're just saying we're just here innocently operating this business without recognising all the inadvertent effects of damage that can do, and saying, well, it's what the people want and what consumers want. And my opinion is that they're playing the politics and trying to put pressure through public. It's a new trendy thing for people to use, which puts pressure on politicians, which shows they think they can win the battle that way. And I think that's offensive. I think it needs to be transparent on what all the damage that can be done from a new business that hasn't been properly reviewed, and until that's done, they shouldn't be allowed to operate.
No worries. More questions, Michael? Okay, I might just throw this one in for Mr. Carter. Are you aware there is a disagreement over whether Uber and other ride-sharing services are operating illegally? If the bill is passed and the legality of those services is still uncertain, some may consider it unfair for Uber driver to have demerit points recorded on their traffic history. Do you have a view about that?
Well, I just think in the broader context, I think I'm trying to think of an analogy, but if I was a bit sketchy on selling booze out of my house, I just wouldn't do it. And if someone else asked me to do it for them and stand in, I just wouldn't do it. So if you want to participate in that space, you run the risk yourself. And I think it's been made pretty clear that there's a strong risk. I believe, it's been, the Minister herself has said that it's unlawful. We've had DTMR saying it's unlawful. I think that's a pretty good signal to drivers that should throw enormous red flags to them to say they're putting themselves at risk. So it's unfortunate that they've been driven or misled to that point where they think that they're fine and they're protected, but that's not the case, and that's an unfortunate situation. I think that's been driven by the determination and speed that they've tried to ram this business model into the market without going through the proper channels that every other business has ever had to do.
No further questions?
Just on the insurance aspect, Robbie, that we talked to RACQ about, they were quite unsure whether an Uber driver may be covered by insurance.
Yeah.
Is that something that we should look at putting into this bill somehow, or doing something there?
Well, that's probably a very pertinent comment. On reflection, I find it really interesting that an organisation that has to take all the comprehensive issues of their drivers into play around Queensland would just sidelines that issue as not impacting or important. I think we've got to be a lot more responsible if you're in positions of these to acknowledge that that's a risk and that it is a problem, and surely, at least out of a sense of caution, there should be a lot more attention paid to that issue.
Well, thanks, Mr. Caddo. No more questions. I'll just make a comment before I close the hearing down. I thank everybody for their attendance here today. I know at times it gets a little bit difficult to keep respect flowing in all directions, but I thank you for your efforts in doing so. This committee is a very open committee, and we're determined to have every opportunity to meet with interested stakeholders and including members of the public who wish to come along and hear whatever is presented and form views, and then it makes them interested in what the outcome will be with regard to the committee. And
we need the cooperation of everybody to make sure that we put forward a fair and reasonable report with regard to not only this matter but a number of other matters that are impacting on across the state. So I thank you for your attention.